It is impossible to understand the force of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy without first stepping back into the world that forged it, a world marked by the tremors of the First World War, the fevered intellectual ferment of the interwar years, and the cataclysmic rupture of the Second World War. Imagine a young boy born in the quiet suburb of Paris, the 21st of June 1905, in a modest household that could scarcely afford the luxuries of culture, yet that somehow managed to place him in the orbit of the most demanding schools of thought of his time. His name was Jean-Paul, and his early life was already a study in paradox. The son of a naval officer who died when Sartre was only a year old, raised by a mother who worked as a seamstress, and later adopted by his maternal aunt, a woman of modest means but great ambition for her nephew. The loss of his father left a void that would later echo in Sartre's preoccupation with absence, freedom, and the weight of responsibility. From the moment he entered the Lycée du Havre in 1919, Sartre exhibited an appetite for learning that seemed to devour the ordinary. He was a brilliant student, a prodigy in mathematics, and yet he was equally drawn to literature, to the poetry of Baudelaire, to the novels of Flaubert, to the theatre of Ibsen. This duality and intellectual rigor married to a poetic sensibility was the first hint of the synthesis that would later characterize his philosophical project. He was not content to be merely a mathematician or merely a literary critic. He wanted to understand how the world could be both a set of logical structures and a stage for human drama. In 1924, at the age of 19, Sartre earned a place at the École Normale Supérieure, the elite institution that had produced the likes of Marcel Proust, Paul Valéry, and later, Michel Foucault. The ENS was more than a university. It was a crucible where the brightest minds of France were melted together, where ideas collided, and where the very notion of what it meant to be an intellectual was constantly being renegotiated. The atmosphere was electric, and the corridors of the ENS were alive with heated debates about the nature of consciousness, the role of the state, the crisis of values that seemed to loom over Europe after the Great War. It was within those hallowed halls that Sartre first encountered phenomenology, a movement that would become the backbone of his early philosophical work. Phenomenology, as formulated by Edmund Husserl, proposed that philosophy should return to the things themselves, to the lived experience of consciousness before any theoretical abstraction could be imposed. Husserl's method of epiché, the suspension of judgment about the existence of the external world, was a radical invitation to examine the structures of perception, intentionality, and meaning as they present themselves to the mind. Sartre attended a series of seminars led by the French philosopher and Husserlian disciple, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was then a fellow student at the ENS. In those seminars, the young Sartre was introduced to the notion that consciousness is always consciousness of something, that the no-thingness of the world is not a void but a horizon of possibilities. One anecdote from this period illustrates both Sartre's intellectual vigor and his restless nature. In 1929, after a particularly intense discussion on the nature of intentionality, Sartre, then a budding scholar, allegedly stormed out of the lecture hall, clutching a copy of Husserl's Logical Investigations under his arm, and fled to the nearby Café de Flore. There he sat for hours, scribbling furiously on napkins, arguing with himself that Husserl's emphasis on the transcendental ego left insufficient room for the concrete, historical, and social dimensions of human existence. He later wrote in a diary entry, "I feel the weight of the world pressing against the walls of my mind, and I cannot simply suspend it in a phenomenological bracket without feeling that I am denying the very flesh of life." This restless questioning set the stage for his later synthesis of phenomenology with existential freedom. While phenomenology was reshaping his conception of consciousness, another intellectual current was pulling at Sartre's imagination, Marxism. The 1930s in France were a time of political polarization, with the rise of both fascist and communist movements. Sartre, who had been raised in a Catholic environment but had already begun to doubt the dogmas of the Church, found in Marx's critique of capitalism a language that could articulate the social forces that seemed to shape individual destiny. He read Karl Marx's Capital and Friedrich Engel's The Condition of the Working Class in England with a hunger that matched his earlier appetite for Husserl. Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries who embraced Marxism as a doctrinal system, Sartre approached it with a phenomenological sensibility. He was fascinated by the way Marx described the alienation of labor, the estrangement of workers from the products of their work, and he saw in that alienation a concrete manifestation of the abstract nothingness that phenomenology described. In a letter to his friend Raymond Aron in 1936, Sartre wrote, "Marx gives us the material conditions, but Husserl gives us the lived experience of those conditions." To understand the human being, we must hold both in our hands, like two lenses that together bring the world into focus. This synthesis would later become the cornerstone of his famous work, Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he attempted to reconcile the freedom of the individual with the determinism of historical materialism. The intellectual climate of the interwar period was also heavily influenced by the avant-garde literary movements that sought to break free from the constraints of traditional forms. The Surrealists, led by André Breton, were proclaiming a revolution of love that would overthrow rationalism and unleash the unconscious. The Dadaists, with their anti-art stance, were mocking the very idea of meaning. Sartre, though never a formal member of the Surrealist group, was deeply impressed by their insistence that art could be a vehicle for radical political change. He attended the 1937 International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris, where he stood before a painting by Max Ernst and felt an uncanny resonance with the painting's chaotic, dream-like composition. He later recalled, "In that moment, I sensed that the absurdity of the world could be captured not just in philosophy, but in the very brushstrokes that defied logic." This encounter would later inform his own literary experiments, where he would blend existential themes with the theatrical techniques of the avant-garde. Sartre's personal life during these formative years also played a crucial role in shaping his philosophical outlook. In 1930, while still a student at the ENS, he met Simone de Beauvoir, a fellow philosopher and writer, at a gathering of the Cercle des Étudiants. Their first conversation was reportedly a debate about the nature of freedom, with Beauvoir asserting that freedom is the source of all oppression, and Sartre retorting that freedom is the condition of oppression. The intensity of their intellectual exchange sparked a partnership that would last a lifetime. Their relationship was not a conventional romance. It was a mutual commitment to project each other's freedom, an experiment in living the very ideas they would later articulate. Their famous pact of transparency, where each would be free to pursue other love affairs while remaining honest about it, was a lived embodiment of Sartre's later claim that existence precedes essence. Their collaboration would later produce some of the most influential existential works of the 20th century, including Being and Nothingness and The Second Sex. The interwar years were also marked by the rise of fascism across Europe, a dark tide that would soon engulf France. The Spanish Civil War 1936–1939 was a particularly potent catalyst for Sartre's political consciousness. He wrote for the newspaper Le Populaire, condemning the rise of Franco's forces and praising the Republican resistance. In a 1937 essay titled The Real World, he declared, "The world is not a stage for abstract ideas. It is a battlefield where the concrete struggles of the oppressed must be taken seriously." This stance was not merely rhetorical. It foreshadowed his active involvement in the French resistance during the Second World War. When the German army invaded France in May 1940, Sartre, then a young intellectual with a growing reputation, was drafted into the French army. He was captured during the Battle of Dunkirk and spent the next 12 months as a prisoner of war in the Stalag Roman 7C camp near the town of Laufen. The experience of imprisonment was a crucible that forged his ideas about freedom and responsibility. One vivid anecdote from this period involves a night in the camp when a fellow prisoner, a German deserter named Karl, confided that he had joined the resistance because he could no longer bear the moral weight of serving a regime that murdered innocents. Sartre listened, and later in his memoir, The Words, he recalled the moment with a tremor in his voice. "In the dim light of the barracks, I saw that freedom is not a condition bestowed by the world. It is a decision made in the darkest of places." The imprisonment also gave Sartre the time and solitude to write the first drafts of what would become Being and Nothingness. He wrote on a small piece of paper, using a charcoal pencil, the phrase "El homme est condamné à error libre," man is condemned to be free. The paradox of being condemned to freedom, of being forced to choose even when the world seems to deny you any genuine options, would become the central thesis of his existentialism. After his release in 1941, Sartre returned to Paris, a city now under the heavy hand of German occupation. He resumed his teaching at the Lycée du Havre, but more importantly, he joined the intellectual resistance. He began writing for the clandestine newspaper Les Lettres Françaises, and he organized secret meetings of writers, philosophers, and artists who sought to keep the flame of French culture alive. In 1943, he published his first major philosophical work, Being and Nothingness, under a pseudonym to avoid censorship. The book, dense and ambitious, attempted to map the structure of consciousness to demonstrate that human beings are nothingness that defines themselves through their choices. It was a direct challenge to the deterministic ideologies of both fascism and, paradoxically, to the abstract idealism of some contemporary philosophers who seemed detached from the concrete suffering of the occupied world. The French Resistance was not just a political movement, it was a crucible for existential thought. Sartre's involvement gave him a front-row seat to the moral dilemmas that arise when individuals are forced to act under extreme conditions. He witnessed the choices of ordinary citizens, some who hid Jews in their basements, others who betrayed them for a piece of bread. He saw the anguish of a young woman who, when asked to join a sabotage mission, hesitated because she feared for her child. These lived experiences fed directly into his later assertion that existence is a project. For Sartre, the act of resisting was an affirmation of freedom, an act of defining oneself against an oppressive world. Yet not everyone accepted Sartre's synthesis of phenomenology, Marxism, and existential freedom. A significant strand of criticism came from contemporaries who accused phenomenology of being overly abstract, detached from the material conditions that shape human life. The analytic philosopher Rudolf Carnap, a leading figure of the Vienna Circle, wrote in a 1935 review of Husserl's work that the phenomenological reduction is a methodological fantasy that pretends to strip away the world in order to study the mind. But in doing so, it ignores the very fact that the mind is always already embedded in a world of language, culture, and science. Carnap's critique, though aimed at Husserl, reverberated in the French philosophical community and was echoed by the young Michel Foucault, who later argued that the subject is not a transparent entity but a product of discursive practices. From this perspective, Sartre's insistence on a pure, pre-theoretical consciousness was seen as a retreat into solipsism, a dangerous abstraction that could not account for the concrete oppression of the working class. Another line of criticism came from the Marxist left, particularly from the French Communist Party, PCF. While the PCF welcomed Sartre's anti-fascist stance, they were wary of his existential emphasis on individual freedom, which they feared could undermine the collective struggle. In a 1945 party congress, the PCF's ideological secretary, Maurice Thorez, warned that the existentialist celebration of personal freedom risks fragmenting the proletariat's unity. We must remember that history is driven by class struggle, not by the whims of isolated individuals. Sartre responded in his 1946 essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, arguing that the freedom of each individual is inseparable from the freedom of others. To deny one is to deny the other. This dialectical tension between the individual and the collective would haunt Sartre throughout his career, leading him to later attempts at a dialectical existentialism that tried to reconcile the two. To place Sartre within a broader existential lineage, it is helpful to recall the earlier philosophers who laid the groundwork for his thought. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, famously introduced the concept of the leap of faith, the idea that an individual must make a passionate, non-rational commitment to live authentically. Kierkegaardian anxiety, or angst, described the dizzying dizziness that arises when one confronts the infinite possibilities of choice. Sartre took this anxiety and stripped it of its theological veil, transforming it into a secular condition. Man is condemned to be free. He is thrown into the world without a predetermined essence and must create his own values. In this sense, Sartre's existentialism can be seen as a continuation of Kierkegaard's project, but one that rejects the necessity of a divine guarantor. Similarly, Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation of the will to power resonated with Sartre's emphasis on self-creation. Nietzsche argued that life is an endless struggle for the assertion of one's own values, a dynamic process of becoming rather than being. Sartre echoed this when he wrote, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." Both philosophers shared a disdain for the herd morality that stifles individuality. Yet Sartre diverged from Nietzsche in his insistence that freedom is accompanied by responsibility. The freedom to create values also entails the responsibility to recognize the freedom of others. This ethical dimension is where Sartre's thought departs from Nietzsche's more individualistic, sometimes amoral, vision. The interwar intellectual climate also brought Sartre into contact with other French thinkers who would later become his interlocutors, allies, or opponents. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who had introduced him to Husserl, later critiqued Sartre's pure consciousness model in his work Phenomenology of Perception, arguing that perception is always already situated in a body, in a world, and therefore cannot be reduced to a simple act of intentionality. Merleau-Ponty wrote, "The body is not a mere object in the world, it is the horizon through which the world is disclosed." This critique forced Sartre to rethink the relationship between the mind and the body, a tension that surfaces in his later writings on the look and the body for others. Another contemporary, Albert Camus, a fellow French existentialist and close friend, offered a different perspective on the absurd. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus argued that the absurd arises from the clash between the human desire for meaning and the indifferent universe. While Sartre embraced this absurdity as a call to create meaning through freedom, Camus warned that the endless project of self-creation could become a form of nihilism if not tempered by a modest acceptance of the limits of human knowledge. Their friendship, though deep, was later strained by political disagreements, most notably over the Soviet Union and the Algerian War, illustrating how existential ideas could diverge sharply when applied to concrete political realities. Returning to Sartre's wartime experiences, another vivid anecdote illuminates the way his philosophy was forged in the crucible of resistance. In the summer of 1943, while underground in the French resistance, Sartre and a small group of comrades were tasked with forging identity papers for Jews and political dissidents. The operation required meticulous attention to detail, a deep understanding of bureaucratic language, and an unwavering belief that the act itself could alter the fate of a human being. As they worked in a cramped attic above a bakery, Sartre whispered to a young courier, "We are not just printing documents. We are inscribing freedom onto the skin of the world." This moment encapsulated his belief that existential freedom was not an abstract principle, but an active material practice, an idea he would later formalize as existence as project. After the liberation of Paris in August 1944, Sartre emerged from the shadows into a city eager for new ideas. The intellectual vacuum left by the discredited Vichy regime invited fresh philosophical proposals. Sartre's post-war lectures at the Sorbonne attracted crowds of students hungry for a philosophy that could explain their sense of disorientation. He delivered his famous lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, on October 29, 1945, a talk that would become one of the most widely read introductions to existential thought. In that lecture, he famously declared, "Man is condemned to be free. He is thrown into existence before he can determine his own essence." He also addressed the criticism that existentialism was a pessimistic or nihilistic doctrine, countering, "We are free, but we are also responsible for the freedom of others." This proclamation resonated with a generation that had witnessed the horrors of war, the betrayal of institutions, and the collapse of traditional moral frameworks. The post-war existential crisis was not limited to France. Across Europe, intellectuals grappled with the moral vacuum left by the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and the rise of totalitarian ideologies. In this context, Sartre's ideas about freedom, responsibility, and authenticity found fertile ground. Yet his philosophy also faced scrutiny from those who believed that the emphasis on individual freedom ignored the structural forces that had enabled such atrocities. The French philosopher Louis Althusser, a Marxist structuralist, argued in his 1965 essay on the materialist dialectic that the human subject is a product of ideological state apparatuses. To speak of freedom without analyzing the underlying structures is to be naive. Althusser's structuralist critique would later inspire the post-structuralist turn, but at the time it served as a direct challenge to Sartre's existential anthropology. Even within the existential tradition, there were internal disagreements. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher whose early work had heavily influenced Sartre's phenomenology, had taken a divergent path. Heidegger's Being and Time emphasized being in the world, Dasein, as fundamentally thrown into a historical context, and he famously declared that the human being is not a subject, but a being that is always already situated. While Sartre adopted Heidegger's analysis of thrownness, he rejected Heidegger's ontological conclusions that seemed to dissolve the individual's capacity for authentic choice. In a private correspondence with Heidegger in 1945, Sartre wrote, "Your analysis of Dasein gives me a profound sense of the weight of history, yet I cannot accept that this weight erases the possibility of freedom. For me, history is the stage upon which freedom is performed, not the script that binds it." This exchange underscores the dynamic tension between the two thinkers. Both shared a concern for authenticity, but diverged on whether authenticity could be achieved within the constraints of historical determinism. Sartre's philosophical formation also cannot be fully understood without considering the influence of the literary avant-garde, particularly the Surrealists. In 1938, Sartre attended a gathering at the Café de la Rotonde, where André Breton, the self-proclaimed Pope of Surrealism, was delivering a manifesto that called for the revolution of love to overthrow the bourgeois order. Breton's emphasis on the unconscious and the irrational resonated with Sartre's own desire to break free from the constraints of rationalist philosophy. Yet, Sartre was critical of the surrealist's tendency to romanticize the unconscious as a source of liberation. He wrote in a 1939 essay, "The surrealist's dream is a refuge, not a battlefield. To truly confront the absurd, we must awaken, not retreat." This critique would later surface in his play No Exit, where the characters are trapped not in a dreamlike landscape, but in a concrete social reality that forces them to confront their own choices. In the realm of personal relationships, the meeting between Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in 1929 stands as a pivotal moment that shaped both of their intellectual trajectories. Their first encounter occurred at a party hosted by the philosopher Raymond Aron, where they engaged in a heated debate about the nature of freedom. Beauvoir, already an emerging feminist thinker, argued that the woman's freedom is always mediated by the man's freedom, while Sartre countered that freedom is a universal condition, but its expression is always contextual. Their intellectual sparring quickly turned into a partnership of equals, a joint project that would challenge the traditional gender norms of their time. Their collaboration produced not only philosophical texts, but also a shared lifestyle that embodied the existential principle of living one's philosophy. Their pact of freedom, the agreement to remain honest about their extramarital affairs, was not merely a personal arrangement, but an experiment in existential authenticity. In a letter to a friend in 1943, Beauvoir wrote, "We are two beings who have chosen each other as the greatest project of our lives, yet we refuse to be reduced to a single identity. Our love is a constant negotiation of freedom." Sartre's reflections on this relationship later appeared in his autobiographical work, The Words, where he described their love as a theater of freedom, where each act is a choice, each scene a responsibility. The post-war existential crisis also found expression in Sartre's engagement with the French resistance's moral dilemmas. One particular incident illustrates how his philosophy was put to the test. In 1944, a fellow resistance member, a young Jewish woman named Miriam, was captured by the Gestapo. The group faced a harrowing decision: attempt a rescue that could jeopardize the entire network or leave her to her fate. Sartre, present at the meeting, argued that the choice itself is the essence of freedom. To act is to affirm one's existence, even at the cost of potential failure. The group decided to mount a rescue, which ultimately succeeded, but at great personal risk. This episode became a touchstone in Sartre's later writings on The Look and the Other, where he explored how the presence of another consciousness can both limit and expand one's freedom. In Being and Nothingness, he famously wrote, "The look of the other is the gaze that makes us an object for someone else, and yet it is precisely this objectification that forces us to confront our own freedom." The rescue of Miriam, therefore, was not merely an act of bravery, but a concrete illustration of Sartre's claim that freedom is exercised in the face of the other's judgment. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Sartre's intellectual trajectory turned toward a more explicitly political orientation. He co-founded the literary magazine Les Temps Modernes in 1945, a platform that would become a vehicle for his existentialist ideas as well as his political activism. The magazine's first issue featured an essay titled Existentialism and Marxism, where Sartre attempted to bridge the gap between the abstract freedom of existentialism and the concrete analysis of class struggle. He wrote, "If we are to speak of freedom, we must speak of the conditions that make freedom possible. The existentialist must not ignore the material world, just as the Marxist must not deny the individual's capacity to choose." This synthesis was not without controversy. The French Communist Party, while initially supportive of Sartre's anti-fascist stance, grew increasingly critical of his insistence on individual autonomy, fearing it could undermine collective action. In a 1948 editorial, the PCF warned that the existentialist celebration of personal freedom risks fragmenting the proletarian movement into isolated acts of rebellion. Sartre responded by emphasizing that the freedom of each individual is intrinsically linked to the freedom of all. A man who denies the freedom of another is, in fact, denying his own. The cross-reference to Kierkegaard's leap of faith and Nietzsche's will to power becomes especially relevant when we consider Sartre's post-war shift toward political engagement. Kierkegaard's leap was an act of faith in the face of absurdity, a personal commitment that transcended rational justification. Sartre's commitment was not to a deity, but to the project of freedom itself, a secular leap that demanded action despite the absence of any predetermined meaning. Nietzsche's will to power, meanwhile, emphasized the creative force that drives individuals to assert themselves. Sartre took this drive and reframed it as an ethical imperative. The will to create oneself must be accompanied by a responsibility toward the other. In Existentialism is a humanism, he famously declared, man is condemned to be free. He is also condemned to be responsible. This coupling of freedom and responsibility is the philosophical bridge that connects the existential lineage from Kierkegaard's faith to Nietzsche's power, while also anchoring it in the concrete historical moment of post-war France. The philosophical formation of Sartre was also colored by his interactions with the literary avant-garde beyond the Surrealists. He attended the gatherings of the Club des Belles Lettres, where poets like Paul Éluard and writers such as Louis Aragon discussed the role of art in resistance. Aragon's poem Le Front Populaire celebrated the workers' struggle and the hope for a new social order. Sartre, listening to the verses, felt the resonance between poetic imagination and political commitment. He later wrote in a diary entry, "The poet's word is a weapon, just as the philosopher's concept is a hammer. Both can shape the world if they are wielded with intention." This belief in the transformative power of language would later inform his concept of narrative identity, the idea that individuals construct themselves through the stories they tell about themselves and their actions. The intellectual climate of the interwar period also brought Sartre into contact with the rising field of psychoanalysis. While he never became a disciple of Sigmund Freud, he was intrigued by the way psychoanalysis explored the unconscious drives that shape human behavior. In a 1935 conversation with the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, Sartre expressed skepticism about the determinism implicit in Freudian theory. He argued, if we reduce the human being to a set of unconscious impulses, we erase the possibility of authentic choice. Lacan, in turn, responded that the unconscious is structured like a language. It is not a deterministic chain, but a system of signifiers that can be reinterpreted. This exchange foreshadowed later debates about the compatibility of existential freedom with the insights of psychoanalysis, a tension that would surface in the works of later existential psychoanalytic thinkers such as Rollo May. Returning to Sartre's formative years, it is essential to recall the specific historical events that shaped his worldview. The Great Depression of 1929, which devastated economies across Europe and America, exposed the fragility of the capitalist system that had seemed invincible after the war. The rise of fascist movements in Italy, Germany, and Spain, coupled with the failure of the League of Nations to prevent aggression, created a sense of impending catastrophe. Sartre, observing these events from his student apartment on Rue d'Ulm, wrote in a journal entry, "The world is a stage of contradictions, liberty proclaimed while chains are tightened, progress promised while the ground crumbles beneath us." This awareness of the dissonance between political rhetoric and lived reality sharpened his critique of abstract philosophical systems that ignored the material conditions of oppression. The interwar period also witnessed the birth of the Nouvelle Philosophie movement, a group of young French philosophers who sought to break away from the dominant Cartesian rationalism. They advocated for a philosophy of existence, a term that would later be popularized by Sartre. Among them were Gabriel Marcel and Emmanuel Levinas, who, although later diverging from Sartre's existentialism, shared an early commitment to exploring the lived experience of the human being. Marcel in particular emphasized the mystery of being, a notion that resonated with Sartre's own preoccupation with the nothingness that underlies existence. Their early dialogues, often held in cafes along the Seine, were marked by a mixture of camaraderie and intellectual rivalry, a dynamic that pushed Sartre to refine his arguments and sharpen his critiques. Sartre's intellectual formation was not confined to the abstract realm of philosophy, it was also shaped by his exposure to the arts. In 1931, he attended the premiere of Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring, at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. The scandalous reaction of the audience, shouts, boos, and even fights left an indelible impression on Sartre. He later recalled, "The music shattered the old order, forcing us to confront a new reality where tradition could no longer dictate meaning." This experience of artistic rupture mirrored his philosophical aim to dismantle the ontological scaffolding that had constrained human freedom for centuries. The political turbulence of the 1930s also brought Sartre into contact with anti-colonial movements. He attended a lecture by Ho Chi Minh, then a Vietnamese nationalist, in Paris in 1935. Ho Chi Minh spoke of the struggle for independence as a manifestation of the universal desire for freedom. Sartre was moved by the idea that the fight for liberation was not merely a national issue, but a manifestation of the human condition. He later wrote, "The oppressed peoples of the world are the living proof that freedom is a universal demand, not a privilege of the West." This insight would later inform his support for anti-colonial movements in Algeria and Vietnam, illustrating how his early exposure to global struggles expanded his existential framework beyond the confines of European thought. One of the most striking anecdotes from Sartre's early years involves his encounter with the playwright Antonin Artaud, a figure whose theater of cruelty sought to shatter the complacency of the audience. In 1937, Sartre attended a rehearsal of Artaud's experimental play, Les Sensei. The performance was chaotic, filled with guttural cries and stark, unsettling imagery. After the show, Sartre approached Artaud and asked, "What is the purpose of this cruelty?" Artaud responded, "To awaken the audience from their sleep, to force them to confront the rawness of existence." Sartre later reflected that this encounter taught him that philosophy could be as visceral as theater, that ideas could be enacted on stage to provoke a deeper awareness of freedom and responsibility. This lesson would later inform his own dramatic works, such as No Exit, where the existential themes are dramatized through the claustrophobic setting of a single room. The intellectual lineage that shaped Sartre also includes the German philosopher Max Scheler, whose phenomenological ethics emphasized the hierarchy of values and the role of empathy in moral judgment. Sartre, while critical of Scheller's value hierarchy, appreciated the emphasis on the lived experience of others. In a lecture on ethics, he quoted Scheler stating, "The feeling of empathy is the foundation of moral intuition." Sartre, however, argued that empathy must be coupled with a conscious choice to act, lest it remain a mere feeling without ethical weight. This dialogue with Scheler illustrates Sartre's broader strategy of engaging with contemporary philosophers, extracting useful insights, and then reworking them within his own existential framework. When the war finally ended in 1945, France faced an existential crisis of its own. The nation had been humbled, its institutions discredited, and its citizens left to grapple with the moral ambiguity of collaboration, resistance, and survival. Sartre's post-war philosophy can be seen as a direct response to this crisis. He argued that the existential vacuum, left by the collapse of traditional authority, required individuals to assume responsibility for creating meaning. In a lecture at the Sorbonne, he declared, "The end of the war is not the end of the struggle. It is the beginning of the responsibility to rebuild the world through our choices." This call to action resonated with a generation that felt both liberated and lost. The counterarguments that emerged during this period were sharp and varied. Analytic philosophers, such as A.J. Ayer, dismissed existentialism as pseudo-philosophy, arguing that Sartre's reliance on subjective experience lacked the empirical rigor required for meaningful philosophical discourse. Ayer wrote in his 1946 review, "Sartre's existentialism is an elegant narrative, but it fails to provide verifiable propositions. It is philosophy as literature, not philosophy as science." This critique forced Sartre to defend the legitimacy of phenomenological description as a form of knowledge, asserting that lived experience is a valid source of philosophical insight, even if it does not conform to the standards of logical positivism. From the Marxist left, critics like Georges Politzer argued that Sartre's focus on individual freedom ignored the structural forces that shape consciousness. Politzer claimed the human being is a product of the mode of production. To speak of freedom without analyzing the class relations that condition it is to be naive. Sartre responded by emphasizing his concept of situated freedom, the idea that while individuals are embedded in social structures, they retain the capacity to transcend those structures through conscious action. He wrote, "Even the most oppressed worker can choose to resist, to organize, to imagine a different future." This dialogue illustrates the dialectical tension that would persist throughout Sartre's career, a tension between the abstract freedom of phenomenology and the concrete constraints of historical materialism. To further illustrate Sartre's intellectual formation, consider his interaction with the French poet Paul Valéry. In 1932, Sartre attended a lecture by Valéry on the art of poetry. Valéry argued that poetry is a pure creation that transcends the mundane. Sartre, however, challenged this notion, asserting that poetry, like philosophy, must engage with the world's conditions. He later wrote, "Poetry that does not confront the world is a retreat into illusion." It is the existentialist's task to bring poetry back to the ground of lived experience. This exchange exemplifies how Sartre's philosophy was not confined to abstract speculation, but was constantly interrogating other fields, literature, art, politics, to test the limits of freedom and responsibility. In the realm of personal narrative, another anecdote underscores Sartre's commitment to living his philosophy. In 1942, while still under the watchful eye of the German occupiers, Sartre and Beauvoir decided to move into a modest apartment on Rue de Vaugirard. The apartment had no heating, and during the harsh winter they often shivered in the cold. Yet, rather than lamenting their circumstances, they saw the hardship as an opportunity to practice authentic existence. Beauvoir wrote in her diary, "We are not victims of poverty. We are actors on a stage where the script is unwritten." Each cold night is a reminder that we must choose how to respond. This lived experience of scarcity reinforced Sartre's belief that freedom is exercised precisely in the face of constraints, a principle he would later articulate as the freedom of the condemned. The French Resistance's moral dilemmas also gave rise to Sartre's famous concept of the look, le regard. In Being and Nothingness, he describes how the presence of the other reduces us to an object, making us aware of ourselves as seen. This concept was not merely an abstract analysis of consciousness. It was informed by the lived reality of being watched by the Gestapo, of having one's movements monitored, of being forced to conceal one's identity. The experience of being reduced to a target by the occupying forces made Sartre acutely aware of how the gaze of the other can both constrain and liberate. He wrote, "In the eyes of the enemy, I am a threat. In the eyes of my comrades, I am a hope. The look is the mirror that reflects the multiple possibilities of my being." Sartre's post-war philosophical project also involved a re-engagement with the ancient Greek tradition. He was fascinated by the figure of Socrates, whom he saw as a prototype of the existential hero, one who lives according to his own principles, even at the cost of his life. In a lecture on Socratic philosophy, Sartre noted, "Socrates chose death rather than compromise his integrity. This act embodies the existential claim that authenticity demands a willingness to face the abyss." By invoking Socrates, Sartre placed himself within a lineage of thinkers who had confronted the tension between personal conscience and societal pressure. The post-war period also saw Sartre's growing interest in the theater as a medium for existential exploration. In 1944, he wrote his first play, The Flies, a reinterpretation of the myth of Orestes set in a contemporary context. The play's protagonist, Electra, is a woman who refuses to accept the moral law imposed by the gods and instead asserts her own freedom. Sartre used the myth to illustrate how individuals can reject imposed narratives and create their own values. He later reflected that mythology is a language that can express the timeless struggle for freedom, just as phenomenology can articulate the structures of consciousness. This synthesis of myth, drama, and philosophy would become a hallmark of his later works. When considering Sartre's intellectual formation, it is impossible to overlook his relationship with the French literary tradition of existential realism, epitomized by writers such as Albert Camus and André Malraux. Camus, in his novel The Stranger, portrayed a protagonist who lives in accordance with the absurd, indifferent to societal expectations. Sartre admired Camus's literary skill but disagreed with his moral stance. Camus's insistence on the absurd hero, who remains detached from political engagement, clashed with Sartre's belief that freedom demands political action. Their famous public dispute in 1952 over the Algerian War highlighted the divergent ways they interpreted existential freedom. Camus advocated for measured moral responsibility, while Sartre called for revolutionary commitment. This debate underscores how Sartre's philosophical formation was not only rooted in abstract ideas, but also in concrete political disagreements with his contemporaries. The influence of Kierkegaard's leap of faith continued to echo throughout Sartre's life. While Kierkegaard framed the leap as a religious act, Sartre secularized it, presenting the existential choice as a leap into the void of freedom. In a 1947 essay, he wrote, "The leap is not a surrender to the divine, but a commitment to one's own freedom in the face of the absurd." This reinterpretation positions Sartre as a modern heir to Kierkegaard, but one who removed the theological scaffolding, leaving the individual to bear the full weight of responsibility. Nietzsche's influence on Sartre was equally profound, though Sartre was careful to avoid the misinterpretations that plagued many of his contemporaries. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead signaled the collapse of absolute moral foundations, a condition that Sartre saw as an opportunity rather than a crisis. He argued that the death of God opened a space for humanity to create its own values, a project that required both courage and authenticity. In Existentialism is a humanism, Sartre famously declared, man creates himself by his choices. There is no divine author to dictate his destiny. This statement can be read as a direct dialogue with Nietzsche's call for the revaluation of values. Sartre's philosophical formation was also marked by his engagement with the tradition of French moral philosophy, particularly the work of the Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's notion of the general will and his emphasis on the natural goodness of humanity resonated with Sartre's belief in the innate capacity for freedom. However, Sartre diverged sharply from Rousseau's social contract theory, arguing that the contract must be continuously renegotiated through individual choices. He wrote, "The social order is not a fixed covenant. It is an ongoing project of freedom, constantly recreated by each act of commitment. This reinterpretation of Rousseau's ideas helped Sartre to articulate a vision of society where freedom and responsibility are mutually reinforcing. In the final analysis of Sartre's early intellectual formation, we see a tapestry woven from diverse threads. The rigorous phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, the material analysis of Marx, the rebellious spirit of the avant-garde, the personal partnership with Simone de Beauvoir, the harrowing experiences of wartime imprisonment and resistance, and the ongoing dialogue with thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Rousseau. Each of these strands contributed to the emergence of a philosophy that insisted on the primacy of freedom, the weight of responsibility, and the necessity of authentic action in a world that often seemed indifferent or hostile. The story of Sartre's formation is not a linear progression from one influence to another, but a dynamic interplay of ideas, experiences, and relationships. It is a reminder that philosophy does not arise in a vacuum. It is forged in the crucible of history, shaped by personal encounters, and tested in the fires of real-world crises. As we reflect on Sartre's early life, his upbringing in modest circumstances, his rigorous education at the École Normale Supérieure, his immersion in phenomenology, his flirtation with Marxist analysis, his immersion in the avant-garde, his love and intellectual partnership with Simone de Beauvoir, his imprisonment and resistance, we begin to understand how the existentialist project was born not merely as an abstract system of thought, but as a lived response to the existential challenges of the 20th century. In the words of Sartre himself, spoken in a quiet moment after the war, "I have lived my philosophy, I have not merely thought it." This declaration encapsulates the essence of his formation. A philosophy that is inseparable from the lived experience of freedom, oppression, love, and resistance. It is a philosophy that continues to speak to us today, urging each of us to confront the void, to make our own choices, and to bear the weight of the responsibility that those choices entail. What does it mean to say that we first exist and only later define what we are? That simple, almost paradoxical claim, existence precedes essence, lies at the heart of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy, and it is the doorway through which we step into a world where freedom is not a privilege but a condition, where responsibility is not an optional add-on but the weight of every breath we take. Let us walk together slowly through the steps of Sartre's ontological argument, pausing at each turn to see how a newborn child, a painter before the canvas, a cafe waiter polishing his silver tray, and even the woman who smiles politely on a first date each illustrate the same fundamental structure of human being. We begin with the most elementary observation. A human being comes into the world without any pre-written script. There is no divine blueprint, no essential nature that determines what that being must become. Sartre writes, "L'existence précède l'essence, existence precedes essence." In other words, the fact that a child is born is prior to any definition of what that child will be. The child does not arrive already stamped with the label artist, teacher, or rebel. Instead, the child first finds itself, breathes, cries, and only later, through choices and circumstances, crafts a self-definition. This is the first step of the argument. Being is a given fact, a brute fact of consciousness that simply is. The second step asks us to consider what we might have expected instead. In many traditional metaphysical systems, essence, an immutable set of properties, precedes existence. Think of a statue. The sculptor first conceives the form, the idea of what the statue will be, and then carves the stone to match that idea. Sartre turns this model on its head. He argues that for human beings, there is no sculptor in the cosmic sense, no pre-existent idea that the universe must instantiate. The human consciousness is not a mirror of a pre-existing form. It is a blank page that the individual must fill. The ontological move here is to deny any metaphysical, God idea that could prescribe a human nature before the fact of human life. The third step follows naturally. If there is no predetermined essence, then every act of choosing becomes the very source of one's identity. The painter before a fresh canvas illustrates this vividly. When the painter lifts a brush, she is not merely expressing a pre-existing style. She is, in that moment, creating a style. Sartre would say, "L'homme est ce qu'il fait," man is what he does. The painter's choice of color, of brushstroke, of subject, does not reveal an inner essence, it constitutes it. Each decision is an act of self-creation, a brick laid in the edifice of the self. From this chain of reasoning, first, the fact of existence, second, the absence of a pre-written essence, third, the necessity of self-definition through action, Sartre builds the doctrine of radical freedom. Freedom for Sartre is not a peripheral capacity, but the very structure of consciousness. He famously declares, El homme est condamné à error libre, man is condemned to be free. The word condemned is not a lament but a recognition that freedom is inescapable. Even the refusal to choose is itself a choice, an affirmation of one's freedom to deny responsibility. The weight of this freedom is ethical. Because we are the authors of our own essence, we are also accountable for the values we embed in that essence. To feel the ethical gravity of radical freedom, imagine the scene Sartre describes in Being and Nothingness, the moment of being for others or pour les autres. A man walks down a bustling Parisian street, aware that every passerby is a gaze that reduces him to an object, a being in itself rather than a being for itself. In that instant, he can either surrender to the stare, allowing the other's judgment to define him, or he can assert his freedom, recognizing that the other's gaze does not determine his essence. He must choose to remain authentic, to own the fact that he is being observed, without letting the observation dictate his self-definition. This tension captures the ethical weight of freedom. We must constantly negotiate the pull of the other while preserving our own self-creation. The cafe waiter example further sharpens this point. In the same work, Sartre describes a waiter who stands at a table, polishing silverware with exaggerated precision, as if he were merely fulfilling a role. The waiter adopts the posture, the gestures, the waiterness as if it were an external script. Sartre calls this bad faith, or mauvaise foi, the act of deceiving oneself by adopting a false identity. The waiter is not simply performing a job, he is denying his freedom by pretending that his role is an immutable fact, that he cannot be anything else. He tells himself, I am a waiter, therefore I must act like a waiter. In doing so, he flees from the responsibility of choosing how to be, even within that role. The act of polishing the silver becomes a ritual that hides the fact that he could, at any moment, decide to leave, to speak differently, to question the hierarchy of the cafe. The waiter's self-deception illustrates how easily we can slip into the comfort of predefined social scripts, thereby evading the anguish of freedom. Bad faith is not limited to the waiter. Sartre offers a second classic case. The woman on a date who, in the polite exchange of conversation, pretends to be merely a girlfriend-to-be, while internally she is already judging the man's manners, his ambition, his future prospects. She smiles, laughs at his jokes, and says, I'm fine, when in fact she feels a deep disquiet. By presenting herself as the passive recipient of his overtures, she denies her own capacity to reject, to assert her own desires. She hides behind the socially sanctioned role of the nice woman and thereby avoids the freedom to say, I do not want this. In Sartre's language, she is performing a script that she has accepted as her essence, rather than recognizing that she has the freedom to rewrite it. The anguish that underlies this performance is the awareness that she could have acted otherwise, yet she chooses to hide that possibility. The notion of bad faith, therefore, is a form of self-lie. It is not a lie told to another, but a lie told to oneself, a refusal to acknowledge the freedom that consciousness inherently possesses. Sartre writes, El homme est libre, il se trompe en se faisant croire qu'il ne l'est pas, man is free. He deceives himself by believing that he is not. This deception is not a simple mistake, it is a deliberate evasion of responsibility. By slipping into the comfort of a role, by allowing the world's expectations to define us, we betray the very condition that makes us human. But Sartre's claims have not gone unchallenged. Martin Heidegger, a contemporary and former mentor, offered a sharp critique. Heidegger argued that Sartre's emphasis on consciousness as a self-standing nothingness overlooks the more fundamental way in which Dasein, Heidegger's term for human existence, discloses itself in the world. Heidegger writes in Being and Time, the ontological difference is not between the being of the world and the being of the self, but between the being of the world as it is disclosed and the being of the self as it is disclosed. In other words, Heidegger suggests that Sartre places the subject too high, treating consciousness as a detached observer that first exists and then defines itself. Heidegger, by contrast, sees human being as already thrown into a world of meanings, tools, and relationships. Our being in the world is not a pure freedom that stands apart from context, but a situated freedom that emerges from our practical engagements. From this perspective, the waiter's polishing is not merely a self-deceptive act, but an embodiment of the world's equipmental structures that shape his possibilities. Heidegger would argue that Sartre's analysis abstracts away the pre-reflective, bodily immersion that already gives shape to our choices. The critique invites us to reconsider whether freedom is as radical and isolated as Sartre paints it, or whether it is always already mediated by the clearing in which we find ourselves. A second, equally powerful critique comes from feminist philosophers, most notably Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong intellectual partner. While de Beauvoir shared many existentialist commitments, she turned Sartre's concept of bad faith toward the analysis of gendered power. In The Second Sex, she observes that women are often compelled to adopt the role of the other, defined by the male gaze, and that this role can be internalized as a form of bad faith. She writes, "One is not born but rather becomes a woman," echoing Sartre's claim about self-creation, yet she shows how societal structures make the becoming heavily constrained. The woman on the date, in Sartre's example, is not merely deceiving herself. She is also navigating a patriarchal script that rewards passivity and punishes assertion. Bad faith, then, can mask the gendered power structures that limit authentic freedom. When a woman smiles and says, "I'm fine," she may be performing a survival strategy within a world that penalizes outspoken dissent. The feminist critique asks us to ask, whose freedom are we celebrating? Is the radical freedom Sartre describes equally accessible to all, or does it presuppose a baseline of social privilege that many are denied? These critiques do not nullify Sartre's insights, but they deepen them. The dialogue between Sartre, Heidegger, and de Beauvoir creates a richer tapestry in which freedom is seen both as a daring individual project and as something that is always already entangled with history, language, and power. This tension also reverberates in the work of Albert Camus, Sartre's friend and fellow existentialist, who turned the question of freedom toward the absurd. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, asks whether the recognition that life has no predetermined meaning should lead us to despair or to rebellion. He concludes that the absurd hero, like Sisyphus, embraces his condition, pushes the stone up the hill, and finds freedom in the very act of rebellion. Camus's absurdism can be read as an extension of Sartre's claim. If existence precedes essence, then the absurdity of the world is the canvas upon which we paint our meaning. The difference lies in Camus's emphasis on the lack of any transcendent moral order, whereas Sartre insists that our freedom carries an ethical weight precisely because we are the ones who must give our actions value. In contemporary debates, the question of agency resurfaces in the field of neuroscience. Advances in brain imaging have revealed that many decisions arise from neural activity that precedes conscious awareness. Some neuroscientists argue that this undermines the notion of free will, suggesting that our sense of freedom is an illusion crafted by post hoc rationalization. Sartre would respond, perhaps, that even if the brain initiates a pattern, consciousness still has the capacity to reflect, to reinterpret, and to choose a different path in the future. The debate is not merely scientific, it is philosophical. As philosopher Peter Vogel notes, the neuroscientific challenge to free will forces us to refine, not abandon, the existential claim that we are always already responsible for our actions. The conversation loops back to Sartre's insistence that freedom is not a metaphysical guarantee, but a lived, phenomenological reality that demands responsibility, even in the face of deterministic findings. Let us return now to the newborn child, the ultimate illustration of existence precedes essence. The infant emerges into the world without language, without culture, without the weight of societal expectations. Yet even in those first months, the child exercises freedom, however rudimentary. When the baby reaches for a toy, it is not following a pre-written script, it is exploring possibilities, testing its own agency. As the child grows, each new choice, whether to cry for comfort, to smile at a caregiver, to later learn to crawl, adds a layer to the emerging self. The child's life is a series of micro-choices that cumulatively forge an identity. Sartre would argue that even the decision to accept the name given by the parents is an act of freedom. The child may later choose to keep that name or to change it, thereby redefining the essence that was initially imposed. The painter, on the other hand, already carries the weight of history, of artistic movements, of market demands. Yet when she stands before the blank canvas, she confronts the abyss of possibility. She could paint a landscape, a portrait, an abstract swirl of color. Each brushstroke is a decision that rejects all other possibilities in that moment. The painter's freedom is radical because she is not bound by any predetermined artist's nature. She is not a genius in the essentialist sense. She is a free agent who, by choosing, creates the very notion of her art. This act is both an affirmation of existence and a rejection of any pre-existing essence. When we examine the cafe waiter, we see the paradox of self-deception more starkly. The waiter's movements are choreographed, his posture disciplined, his speech rehearsed. He tells himself, "I am a waiter. This is my nature." In doing so, he attempts to escape the anguish that comes with the knowledge that he could, at any moment, choose otherwise. Yet the very awareness that he could quit, could speak differently, that he is being watched, is what makes his performance a lie. The waiter's bad faith is a protective shield against the existential dread of absolute freedom. It is a mask that allows him to function within the social order without confronting the abyss of choice. The woman on the date similarly adopts a socially sanctioned mask. She smiles, she nods, she says, "I'm fine," even as a storm of doubts brews inside her. By presenting herself as the compliant companion, she sidesteps the responsibility of asserting her own preferences. Yet the moment she feels the pang of discomfort, she experiences the same existential anxiety that Sartre describes, the awareness that she could say no, could walk away, could redefine the interaction. Bad faith in this case is not merely a personal failing. It is a symptom of a cultural script that rewards acquiescence, especially from women. De Beauvoir would point out that the woman's freedom is constrained not only by her own self-deception, but also by the patriarchal expectations that make the honest expression of desire risky. Heidegger's critique invites us to look beyond the individual's interiority and consider the world that shapes these scenarios. The café is not a neutral space. It is a social institution with its own history, its own hierarchy of service. The waiter's role is embedded in a network of expectations, wages, and cultural meanings about hospitality. His freedom, then, is not a pure, isolated choice, but a navigation of those structures. Similarly, the woman's date takes place within a cultural script of romance, of gendered courtship. The bad faith she performs is not merely an internal denial, but a response to an external order that rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. Camus's absurd hero provides a different lens. Imagine Sisyphus forever pushing the stone up the hill, aware that the task is futile. Yet Camus says that Sisyphus can find meaning precisely because he embraces his condition. In a similar fashion, the waiter can find authenticity not by denying his role, but by owning it fully, by recognizing that his work is a choice he makes in each moment, even as he polishes the silver. The absurdist perspective reframes the anxiety of freedom as an invitation to creative rebellion, rather than a source of paralyzing dread. The modern neuroscience debate adds yet another layer. Studies of the readiness potential show that the brain initiates an action milliseconds before we become conscious of the decision. Some interpret this as evidence that free will is an illusion. Sartre, however, would argue that consciousness, even if it follows neural initiation, remains the site where meaning is assigned. The act of reflecting on the readiness potential, of interpreting it as "my brain prepared me," is itself a free act of interpretation. The responsibility to give our actions meaning does not evaporate because the brain's machinery is involved. Rather, it underscores the complexity of the freedom we claim. It is not a simple, unmediated will, but a layered process of pre-conscious impulses, conscious deliberation, and post-hoc narrative. To bring these threads together, let us revisit the central claim: existence precedes essence. The newborn, the painter, the waiter, the woman on a date all embody this sequence. Their existence is a fact, their essence is a project. Their freedom is radical because it is the very condition that makes any project possible. Yet that freedom is always already entangled with the world, social, historical, biological, that shapes the possibilities they can see. Bad faith is the temptation to simplify this entanglement into a fixed role, to hide the responsibility that freedom entails. Heidegger reminds us that we are always already thrown into a world that pre-structures us. De Beauvoir warns that gendered scripts can make bad faith a survival strategy for the oppressed. Camus encourages us to confront the absurdity of a world without given meaning by creating our own. Neuroscience challenges us to locate where the self truly resides in the decision-making process. What then is the ethical implication of this tangled freedom? Sartre insists that we are condemned to be free, and therefore we must act as if our choices set a precedent for humanity. He writes, "In choosing for ourselves, we choose for all." This universalizing claim does not mean that every individual's decision determines the destiny of the species, but that each act of authenticity contributes to the shared horizon of what it means to be human. When the painter chooses an unconventional style, she not only defines herself, but also expands the space of artistic possibility for others. When the waiter decides to treat his work as an expression of his own values rather than a mere performance, he demonstrates that even the most routine actions can be infused with authenticity. When the woman on the date decides to voice her discomfort, she not only asserts her own agency, but also reshapes the expectations of how a date should unfold. In practical terms, this existential ethic invites us to examine everyday moments for hidden choices. The next time we stand in line at a coffee shop, we might ask ourselves, am I merely following the script of customer, or am I consciously choosing how I engage with the barista, how I spend my time, how I treat the environment? When we scroll through social media, are we presenting an authentic self, or are we slipping into a curated persona that masks our freedom? Bad faith, in its many guises, is the subtle art of convincing ourselves that we have no choice, that we are merely the sum of external labels. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward reclaiming the radical freedom that Sartre celebrates. The historical anecdotes that punctuate Sartre's own life help us see how these ideas were lived, not merely theorized. During the German occupation of France, Sartre joined the resistance, not because a predetermined, heroic essence demanded it, but because he chose, in the moment of crisis, to act in a way that defined his existence. He later reflected that the act of resistance was an affirmation of his freedom, even as it placed him in grave danger. Similarly, his famous 1945 lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, was delivered to a crowd of students who demanded a clear, accessible statement of his philosophy. Sartre seized the moment to argue that humanity is not bound by a divine plan, but by the freedom to create meaning, a public performance that turned abstract ideas into lived urgency. Another anecdote comes from the collaboration between Sartre and de Beauvoir. Their partnership was a continuous experiment in living the philosophy they espoused. They famously declared that they would remain essentially free within their relationship, refusing to bind themselves to conventional marital expectations. Their arrangement, however, was not a simple romantic ideal. It involved constant negotiation, jealousy, and the awareness that each could choose to leave. Their lived experience of freedom, love, and bad faith provides a vivid illustration of how existential concepts play out in the messy terrain of human relationships. The painter's story also has a historical counterpart. In the early 20th century, the French painter Georges Braque, alongside Pablo Picasso, broke away from representational art to develop Cubism. Their decision was not dictated by an essential artist, nature. Rather, it emerged from a series of choices, experiments with perspective, collaborations, and the desire to capture multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Their radical departure from tradition exemplifies Sartre's claim: the act of choosing a new style creates a new artistic essence. The very act of painting a cube on a canvas is an affirmation that existence, here, the existence of the canvas and the painter, precedes any predetermined artistic essence. Turning now to the modern realm, consider the debate over agency in the age of artificial intelligence. When an algorithm suggests a news article, a job opening, or a romantic match, the user faces a subtle pressure to accept the suggestion. The question arises, does the algorithm diminish our freedom, or does it simply present another set of possibilities for us to choose from? Sartre would likely argue that the presence of an algorithm does not eliminate freedom. It merely expands the horizon of options. However, the user must remain vigilant against the temptation to slip into a form of bad faith, allowing the algorithm to dictate preferences without reflecting on the underlying values. The ethical responsibility, then, is to recognize that even in a technologically mediated world, we remain the authors of our choices. In neuroscience, the famous Libet experiment of the 1980s showed that participants' brains exhibited a readiness potential before they reported a conscious decision to move. Critics seized upon this as proof that free will is an illusion. Yet later studies, such as those by Patrick Haggard, suggest that conscious intention can still veto actions after the readiness potential has begun. This free won't indicates that consciousness can intervene, even if it is not the first spark. Sartre's emphasis on consciousness as the site of freedom does not require that consciousness be the origin of all neural activity. Rather, it insists that consciousness is where meaning is assigned, where responsibility is claimed. The debate, therefore, becomes less about whether the brain starts the action, and more about whether the individual can reflect, reinterpret, and re-choose in the face of those neural impulses. The feminist critique, building on de Beauvoir, further expands the discussion of bad faith into the realm of systemic oppression. In contemporary gender studies, scholars like Judith Butler argue that gender itself is a performance, a series of repeated acts that create the illusion of a stable identity. This aligns with Sartre's notion that we are not born with a fixed essence, but we continuously create ourselves through action. However, Butler also highlights how social power dictates which performances are rewarded and which are punished. Bad faith, then, can become a survival mechanism for those whose authentic choices are systematically constrained. The woman on the date may not simply be deceiving herself. She may be navigating a social landscape where overt rejection could invite harassment or social ostracism. Recognizing this context does not absolve her of responsibility, but it deepens our understanding of the ethical calculus involved in exercising freedom under unequal conditions. Heidegger's emphasis on being in the world also invites us to see the painter's studio not as a neutral backdrop, but as a space filled with tools, light, and history. The painter's freedom is exercised through engagement with these elements. The brush is not merely an instrument, it is a ready-handed object that already carries a set of possibilities. When the painter chooses a particular brushstroke, she is simultaneously affirming her freedom and responding to the world's affordances. This perspective does not diminish Sartre's claim but enriches it, reminding us that freedom is always a dialogue between the self and the world. Finally, let us consider the practical implications for everyday life. Imagine you are faced with a career decision. You could stay in a comfortable, well-paid job, or you could pursue a passion that offers no guarantee of success. Sartre would say that there is no essential career path pre-written for you. You must create your own essence through the choice you make. The anxiety you feel is the anguish of freedom, the recognition that you are wholly responsible for the outcome. Bad faith would be to tell yourself, I can't quit because I'm just a manager, it's my nature. Recognizing that you are free to redefine yourself, even in the midst of financial pressures, is an act of authenticity. Yet Heidegger would remind you that you are already embedded in a corporate culture that shapes your expectations, and de Beauvoir would ask you to consider whether gendered expectations influence your sense of what a good career looks like. Camus would encourage you to embrace the absurdity of the situation, to find joy in the act of choosing itself, regardless of the eventual success or failure. In sum, the core concepts of Sartre's existentialism, existence precedes essence, radical freedom, and bad faith, form a tightly woven philosophical tapestry. The ontological argument, step by step, shows that we first find ourselves in the world, then we must, through each act, write the story of who we are. The painter, the waiter, the newborn, the woman on a date, all become living illustrations of this process. The ethical weight of radical freedom presses us to acknowledge that each choice is a declaration not only of self but of humanity. Bad faith, the self-deception that hides this responsibility, appears in countless guises, from the polished silver of a cafe to the polite smile on a first date. Heidegger's critique invites us to see freedom as always already situated. De Beauvoir's feminist lens reveals how gendered power can shape, and sometimes imprison, our attempts at authenticity. Camus's absurdism reframes the lack of inherent meaning as a fertile ground for rebellion, while contemporary neuroscience challenges us to locate the seat of agency within the brain's circuitry. The conversation does not end here. Each of these threads continues to unfold in modern debates about artificial intelligence, about the neurobiology of decision-making, about social movements that demand the recognition of marginalized voices. As we listen to the echo of Sartre's claim across the decades, we are reminded that the project of defining ourselves is never finished. The canvas remains forever blank, the silver tray forever waiting for the next polish, the newborn forever breathing, the woman forever deciding whether to speak her truth. In the calm, reflective space of this meditation, may we hear the gentle urging of our own freedom, recognize the shadows of bad faith, and step forward consciously into the endless act of becoming. When we speak of Jean-Paul Sartre, the first image that often comes to mind is that of a lone thinker, perched on a Parisian cafe chair, smoking a cigarette, proclaiming that existence precedes essence. Yet beneath that iconic pose lies a dense ethical landscape, one that is built on the simple, almost mundane act of being seen. Sartre's notion of the look, le regard, does not belong solely to the realm of phenomenology. It is the crucible in which freedom is both forged and tested, where the presence of the other becomes the mirror that forces us to confront the weight of our own choices. In this segment, we will follow that mirror step by step, through the theater-goer who feels his own gaze turned back upon him, through the lover who discovers that intimacy can become a form of objectification, and through the historical moments when Sartre himself stood in the glare of public scrutiny. The Algerian War, the Nobel Prize, the very act of refusing to be silenced. We will also hear the voices that challenge his conclusions, former Marxist comrades who claim his ethics are too individualistic, existential feminists who argue that his model neglects relational interdependence, and we will see how those debates echo in contemporary discussions about moral responsibility in artificial intelligence. All of this, of course, is bound together by one relentless question. If freedom is absolute, what does responsibility truly demand of us? Let us begin with the phenomenology of the look. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre writes, the look is a mode of being in the world that reveals the other as a subject, and at the same time reduces the self to an object. Imagine a theater audience, lights dimmed, the curtain rising. You settle into your seat, and as the actors on stage embody their roles, you become aware that somewhere among the rows sits a stranger whose eyes flicker toward you. In that instant, the world shifts. You are no longer simply a spectator. You are an object of observation, a being whose own freedom is suddenly made visible. Sartre describes this moment as a shining forth of the other's consciousness, an involuntary self-reflection that can feel like an intrusion. I am seen, and thus I am forced to become what I am not. The theater-goer, previously absorbed in the play, now feels the weight of being judged, of being reduced to a thing in the world by the simple act of being looked at. This is the paradox at the heart of Sartre's ethics. The other is both the source of our freedom and the source of our objectification. The tension does not end in the darkened auditorium. Consider the lover lying beside you, breathing in rhythm with your own. In the intimate space of a bedroom, the lover's gaze is supposed to be a celebration of subjectivity, a recognition of the other as a free, conscious being. Yet Sartre warns that even love can become a form of the look. In his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, he observes, when we love, we try to make the other a mirror of ourselves, to see in them the image we wish to see. The lover's eyes, instead of merely appreciating the beloved's freedom, may begin to impose a definition upon them, to freeze them into a role, the beloved, the muse, the object of desire. In that moment, the lover's freedom is compromised not by force, but by the very desire to be seen as the object of love. The lover becomes both subject and object, caught in a dialectic that Sartre calls the conflict of the look. The ethical implication is stark. Even our most tender relationships can become arenas of domination if we fail to acknowledge the other's radical freedom. Sartre's answer to this dilemma is not a call for restraint, but a call for radical responsibility. He insists that because we are always already in the presence of the other, we can never escape the fact that our actions are seen, interpreted, and judged. This leads him to the doctrine of absolute responsibility. Man is condemned to be free. The condemnation is not a curse. It is a reminder that we cannot hide behind excuses, even when circumstances seem to leave us no choice. In his preface to the 1946 edition of Being and Nothingness, Sartre writes, "We are responsible for everything, even for what we do not do." The implication is that oppression does not absolve us. Rather, it intensifies the demand to act. If we remain silent in the face of injustice, we are still responsible for the silence, because that silence is itself a choice that affirms the status quo. This principle of responsibility was never more evident than in Sartre's political engagement during the Algerian War. In 1957, as the French government intensified its military campaign against the Algerian independence movement, Sartre published a series of articles in Les Temps Modernes titled Algerian Chronicles. He did not merely comment on the war. He called for a total revolt against colonial oppression, urging French citizens to recognize the Algerian as a fellow subject, a free being whose existence could not be reduced to a mere object of empire. He wrote, "The colonizer's gaze turns the colonized into a thing. To resist is to restore the colonized's freedom to be seen as a subject." For Sartre, the ethical demand was clear. Even if the state wielded overwhelming power, individuals were still responsible for their complicity or resistance. He famously refused to accept a position on the French National Assembly that would have given him a platform to influence policy, because he believed that any institutional role would inevitably compromise his freedom to act authentically. In his own words, to be a politician is to be a man who has already surrendered his freedom to the crowd. A few years later, in 1964, Sartre was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The honor, however, was met not with celebration, but with refusal. In a letter to the Nobel Committee, Sartre explained, "I cannot accept an award that would place me under a different kind of gaze, that would turn my freedom into a public property." He feared that the prize would transform his work into a commodity, a symbol that could be appropriated by the very structures of power he critiqued. By refusing, Sartre demonstrated the same absolute responsibility he demanded of others. He chose to remain consistent with his ethical stance, even at the cost of personal prestige. The refusal itself became a public act of self-objectification. He allowed himself to be seen as a moral exemplar, but he did so on his own terms, preserving his freedom to define his own essence. Sartre's emphasis on responsibility has resonated far beyond his own era, but it has also attracted sharp criticism. Among his former Marxist allies, the most vocal detractors were the French existentialist Marxist circle that included figures like Raymond Aron and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. They argued that Sartre's ethics, by foregrounding individual freedom above all, ignored the material conditions that shape human agency. In a 1955 essay, Aaron wrote, Sartre's insistence that each individual bears full responsibility for every action risks erasing the structural forces, economics, class, history, that constrain choice. From this perspective, Sartre's notion of absolute responsibility appears to be an abstraction that cannot survive the reality of oppression. If a worker is forced to accept a dangerous job because there is no alternative, can we truly hold that worker responsible for the risk they take? The Marxist critique suggests that Sartre's ethics is too individualistic, that it fails to account for the collective dimension of struggle and the ways in which the capitalist system produces subjects who are already objectified by the market. A different line of critique emerged from existential feminists, most notably Simone de Beauvoir, who, while a lifelong collaborator, also pushed Sartre's ideas in new directions. In The Second Sex, Beauvoir reinterprets the look through the lens of gendered oppression. She argues that the male gaze does not simply objectify women, it actively constructs them as the other in a way that denies their freedom to define themselves. Beauvoir writes, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. The process of becoming is mediated by the perpetual look of a patriarchal society that insists on defining women as objects of desire, of reproduction, of moral guardianship. From this feminist standpoint, Sartre's model of the look, which treats the other as a neutral mirror, is insufficient because it does not recognize the asymmetrical power relations that shape the gaze. The ethical demand for absolute responsibility, then, must be expanded to include a responsibility toward dismantling the structures that make the look inherently oppressive for certain groups. In other words, Sartre's ethics, while radical in its insistence on freedom, can be seen as neglecting relational interdependence, the web of social ties that both constrain and enable us. These critiques do not simply stand in opposition to Sartre, they intersect with another philosophical tradition that takes the other even more seriously, the ethics of Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas, a contemporary of Sartre, turned the phenomenology of the look on its head. While Sartre sees the look as a moment of self-objectification that threatens freedom, Levinas views the face-to-face encounter as an ethical summons that precedes any ontological claim. Levinas writes, the face of the other is the trace of infinity that calls me to responsibility. For Levinas, the encounter with the other does not merely reveal us to ourselves. It commands us to answer, to serve, to bear the weight of the other's vulnerability. In this sense, Levinas' ethics of the other can be read as a response to the perceived inadequacy of Sartre's account. Where Sartre emphasizes the freedom of the self, Levinas emphasizes the infinite responsibility owed to the other, a responsibility that is not contingent upon the self's choice, but is imposed by the very presence of the other. The dialogue between these two thinkers sharpens our understanding of responsibility. Sartre asks, what must I do given that I am free? Levinas asks, what must I do given that the other calls me? The conversation between Sartre, Levinas, and contemporary thinkers does not stop at philosophy. It reverberates in the field of artificial intelligence. As machines become capable of perceiving, interpreting, and even looking at us through cameras, sensors, and algorithms, the question of moral responsibility takes on new dimensions. If an autonomous vehicle makes a decision that harms a pedestrian, who bears responsibility? Is it the programmer, the manufacturer, the user, or the machine itself? Sartre's insistence on absolute responsibility suggests that any human involved in the creation or deployment of AI cannot hide behind the complexity of the system. He would argue that the developers, by virtue of their freedom to design, are responsible for the outcomes, even unintended ones. Yet the Levinasian perspective would push us further, urging us to consider the vulnerability of those who are affected by AI decisions as an ethical summons that cannot be reduced to legal liability alone. In this modern arena, the look is no longer a human gaze but a digital one, a network of data points that objectify us, turning us into data subjects. The ethical challenge, then, is to retain our freedom and responsibility in a world where the gaze is increasingly mediated by technology. Let us return now to the theater anecdote, now enriched by these layers of critique. Imagine a modern audience, each person holding a smartphone, streaming the performance live. The look is multiplied. The actors are not only seen by those in the auditorium, but by millions of unseen viewers whose screens reflect their own faces back at them. The performer's freedom to embody a role is now entangled with the digital gaze that records, categorizes, and monetizes the experience. In this scenario, Sartre's warning about the objectifying power of the look feels prescient. The performer must navigate the tension between authentic self-expression and the pressure to conform to the expectations of an ever-watching audience. The responsibility, then, is not only personal but also collective. Each viewer, by choosing to watch, participates in the objectification of the performer. The ethical question becomes, do we watch responsibly, acknowledging the performer's freedom, or do we reduce them to a data point, a meme, a trending hashtag? In this way, Sartre's ethics of the look invites us to consider our role in the digital age, reminding us that every gaze carries an ethical weight. The lover anecdote, too, can be reimagined in the context of social media. Two partners share a photograph of themselves, posting it for the world to see. The image, once intimate, becomes a public object, subject to likes, comments, and the judgments of strangers. The act of posting transforms love into a performance, a curated gaze that seeks validation. Sartre's insight that love can become a form of objectification is amplified. The lover's freedom is compromised not by a single other, but by a network of gazes that each demand a particular representation. The responsibility here is twofold. First, each partner must recognize their own freedom to define the relationship beyond external approval. Second, they must be aware of the ways their digital self-presentation may inadvertently objectify each other, turning affection into a commodity. The ethical tension is palpable. We seek connection, yet we risk reducing ourselves to the sum of external affirmations. Now consider the Algerian War again, but through the lens of Lebanese ethics. The French colonizers, in their attempt to civilize, treated the Algerian populace as objects, territory to be managed, subjects to be controlled. Levinas would argue that the colonizers' refusal to recognize the face of the Algerian as an ethical summons is the root of the violence. Sartre's call for absolute responsibility pushes the colonizer to acknowledge the Algerian's freedom, but Levinas would say that merely recognizing freedom is insufficient. One must answer to the vulnerability exposed in the face of the other. The moral failure, then, is not only a failure of individual responsibility, but a failure of an ethical relationship that never truly began. This perspective deepens Sartre's critique, suggesting that the look can be a moment of ethical awakening only if the gaze is accompanied by an answer, a willingness to serve the other's needs, not just to acknowledge their existence. The Nobel Prize refusal offers a different kind of illustration. By turning down the prize, Sartre refused to let the institutional gaze define his work. He recognized that the honor would place his writings under a new kind of objectification, a commodification that could be used to legitimize the very power structures he opposed. In a sense, he performed an act of existential authenticity. He chose to remain free, even as the world tried to fix his identity. Levinas would see this as an ethical response to the call of the other, here, the other being the global literary community that sought to label him. By refusing, Sartre answered not with acceptance but with a refusal to be reduced to an object of prestige. The responsibility he embraced was not only for his own freedom, but also for the integrity of the ethical relationship between writer and audience. The Marxist critique, however, would ask whether Sartre's personal refusals truly alter the material conditions that shape the lives of the oppressed. They would argue that while Sartre's individual acts are commendable, they do not dismantle the structures that perpetuate colonial violence or the market forces that turn literature into a commodity. In other words, the ethical weight of the look, when applied only to personal authenticity, may become a form of moral exhibitionism, a way of feeling responsible without engaging in collective struggle. This tension points to a central dilemma in Sartre's ethics: how to balance the demand for individual responsibility with the need for collective action. Sartre himself attempted to bridge this gap by joining political movements, by signing petitions, by speaking out against the Algerian War. Yet critics argue that his existential focus on the individual can never fully account for the systemic dimensions of oppression. The existential feminist critique adds another layer. If we accept Beauvoir's analysis that the look is gendered, then Sartre's claim of universal responsibility must be qualified. Women, historically, have been subjected to a gaze that defines them primarily as objects of desire, of reproduction, of moral guardianship. The responsibility that Sartre places on the individual becomes doubly burdensome for those whose freedom is already constrained by patriarchal structures. In this view, the ethical demand is not simply be authentic, but reconfigure the structures that make authenticity impossible. Beauvoir would argue that Sartre's ethics must be supplemented by a feminist praxis that acknowledges relational interdependence. The lover's anecdote, therefore, is not just a caution about objectification, but a call to reimagine love as a mutual recognition of freedom, free from the weight of societal expectations that assign fixed roles. This reinterpretation expands Sartre's notion of responsibility beyond the individual to include a responsibility toward the transformation of relational norms. The dialogue between Sartre and Levinas, between existentialism and Marxism, between existentialism and feminism, continues to shape contemporary ethical debates. In the age of AI, for instance, scholars such as Shannon Valor and Nick Bostrom invoke Sartrean ideas of freedom and responsibility when discussing autonomous systems. Valor writes, "If we design machines that can look at us, we must also design them to respect our freedom, not to reduce us to data." Bostrom, on the other hand, warns that the diffusion of responsibility, the many hands problem, can become a way to evade Sartre's absolute responsibility. He asks, if a corporation's AI causes harm, can any single individual claim responsibility, or does the collective nature of the decision-making dilute moral accountability? Sartre would answer that each participant, by virtue of their freedom to act, bears responsibility, regardless of the scale. Levinas would add that the design of AI must incorporate an ethical responsiveness to the vulnerability of those affected, a kind of machine, face-to-face, that obliges the system to answer. To bring these abstractions back to lived experience, let us imagine a concrete scenario. A self-driving car approaches a pedestrian crossing. The car's sensors detect a person, but the algorithm must decide whether to brake or swerve, potentially endangering the passenger. The look here is the car's gaze upon the pedestrian, a digital embodiment of Sartre's phenomenological look. The programmer who wrote the decision-making code is confronted with the same ethical question Sartre posed. What am I responsible for? The answer, according to Sartre, is that the programmer cannot hide behind the complexity of the system. They must own the consequences of the code they chose to implement. Levinas would remind us that the pedestrian's face, its vulnerability, calls us to answer, to prioritize the life of the other. Feminist and Marxist critiques would caution us to consider how such technologies might disproportionately affect marginalized groups. Perhaps the pedestrian is from a lower-income neighborhood, less likely to have access to safe crossings. Thus, the responsibility is multi-layered, personal, relational, and structural. Returning to the theater goer, we see that the look is not a static moment, but an ongoing process. Each time we lift our eyes, each time we turn a camera toward a person, each time we post a comment, we participate in a chain of gazes that shape reality. Sartre's ethics asks us to remain vigilant, to recognize that our freedom is always already bound up with the freedom of others. The responsibility that follows is not a burden to be resented, but a call to act authentically, to answer the other's summons, to refuse the easy excuse of "it's just the system." The system, after all, is made of individuals who choose to either perpetuate or resist objectification. In summary, Sartre's ethical framework, built upon the look, offers a powerful lens through which to examine the interplay of subjectivity and objectification. The theater goer and the lover serve as vivid illustrations of how the presence of the other forces us to reflect on our own freedom, and how that reflection can become a source of oppression if we allow the gaze to turn us into objects. Sartre's doctrine of absolute responsibility demands that we own every choice, even in the face of oppression, refusing to hide behind external circumstances. His historical actions, his outspoken opposition to the Algerian War, and his refusal of the Nobel Prize embody that principle in concrete form. Yet his ethics does not stand without contest. Former Marxist allies argue that his focus on individual freedom neglects the material structures that limit choice, while existential feminists contend that his model overlooks the relational interdependence that defines human life, especially for women. Levinas's ethics of the other pushes the conversation further, insisting that responsibility precedes freedom, that the face of the other summons us before we even become aware of our own subjectivity. And in the modern arena of artificial intelligence, the look has become a digital gaze, raising fresh questions about moral accountability, the distribution of responsibility, and the vulnerability of those rendered visible by algorithms. The challenge, then, for each of us listening today is to ask ourselves, when we are looked at, when we create technologies that look, how do we respond? Do we allow the look to reduce us to objects, or do we answer the ethical summons it carries? Do we claim responsibility only for our personal choices, or do we extend that responsibility to the structures that shape those choices? In the calm stillness of reflection, perhaps we can hear the echo of Sartre's own words. We are condemned to be free, but it is precisely this condemnation that makes us capable of creating meaning, of answering the other, of bearing the weight of responsibility without excuse. Let that echo guide us as we navigate the countless gazes that surround us, human, digital, historical, and as we strive to live authentically in a world that constantly reminds us we are both subjects and objects, both free and responsible. When we speak of Jean-Paul Sartre, the first image that often comes to mind is that of a solitary thinker, perched on a Parisian café chair, musing about the weight of individual freedom. Yet the story of Sartre's philosophy is also a story of collective struggle, of a mind that refused to keep its ideas confined within the walls of the abstract. In the years following the Second World War, Sartre set out to fuse the existential insistence on radical freedom with the Marxist analysis of material conditions. This uneasy marriage, which reached its most ambitious expression in his massive work Critique of Dialectical Reason, became a crucible for debates that still echo in contemporary leftist discourse. To understand why Sartre felt compelled to bring existentialism and Marxism together, we must first return to the immediate aftermath of the war. France lay in ruins, its political landscape shattered, and the intellectual climate was charged with a desperate need for reconstruction, both material and moral. In 1945, Sartre delivered a lecture that would later be published as Existentialism is a Humanism. In it, he famously declared, "Man is condemned to be free." He argued that freedom is not a luxury, but an inescapable condition of human existence. Each person must choose, and in doing so, creates the meaning of his own life. Yet, at the same time, he acknowledged that our freedom is always situated in a concrete world. This acknowledgement of situationality opened a door to the materialist concerns that Marx had articulated decades earlier. The lecture was both a proclamation and a plea. Sartre wanted to reassure a war-torn public that existentialism was not a cold, individualistic doctrine that ignored suffering. He said existentialism is a doctrine of action. In the same breath, he invoked the notion that the human being is always already in the world. The phrase "already" is a direct echo of Marx's insistence that the individual is embedded in a social totality, that the conditions of production shape consciousness. Sartre's attempt to bridge these ideas was not a simple overlay. It was a genuine attempt to rework the foundations of both traditions. 2 years later, in 1947, Sartre formally joined the French Communist Party, the PCF, convinced that the party offered a vehicle through which his philosophical commitment to freedom could be realized in concrete political action. He saw in the party a collective embodiment of the dialectical process he was trying to articulate, the thesis of individual liberty encountering the antithesis of class oppression, yielding a synthesis in the form of revolutionary praxis. His involvement was not merely symbolic. He contributed articles to the party newspaper, El Humanité, and used his public platform to defend the Soviet Union's role in the defeat of fascism. In a 1946 article, he wrote, "The struggle for the liberation of the human being cannot be separated from the struggle for the emancipation of the working class." But the alliance between Sartre and the PCF was always fraught with tension. The party demanded ideological conformity, while Sartre's existentialism insisted on the irreducibility of personal freedom. This tension came to a head in 1956, after the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Sartre, who had previously praised the Soviet experiment as a great historical moment, now found himself confronting the stark reality of a state that suppressed the very freedom he held dear. In a letter to his friend and fellow philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, dated March 1964, Sartre wrote, "I cannot accept a freedom that is merely formal, a freedom that is proclaimed while the concrete conditions of oppression remain untouched." This letter, later published, marked a decisive break with the PCF and signaled Sartre's turn toward a more critical, anti-authoritarian Marxism. The break did not mean that Sartre abandoned Marxist analysis. Rather, it prompted him to rethink the relationship between individual agency and structural forces. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 2 volumes between 1960 and 1985, he attempted to develop a practical ontology that could accommodate both the spontaneity of human action and the determinacy of historical materialism. He introduced the concept of group praxis, arguing that individuals are always acting within groups that have their own internal logic, yet these groups are themselves shaped by the economic base. He wrote, "The individual is both a product and a producer of the historical world." To illustrate this, Sartre offered the example of a factory worker who, in the course of a strike, discovers a shared sense of purpose with his comrades. The worker's personal decision to join the strike is an act of freedom, but the strike itself is a collective phenomenon that emerges from the material contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. The worker's freedom is thus exercised within, and indeed through, the material conditions that also constrain him. This dialectical interplay was Sartre's answer to the accusation that existentialism reduced politics to a series of isolated choices. Yet Sartre's synthesis was not without its critics. The Frankfurt School, particularly Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, viewed Sartre's existentialism as a dilution of Marxist class analysis. In a 1955 essay, Adorno wrote, "Sartre's freedom is a freedom of the soul, a metaphysical abstraction that fails to grapple with the concrete mechanisms of domination embedded in the capitalist system." The Frankfurt theorist argued that Sartre's emphasis on individual choice risked obscuring the way ideology reproduces itself through cultural institutions. They feared that by foregrounding personal authenticity, Sartre inadvertently opened a space for bourgeois individualism to masquerade as revolutionary agency. The post-structuralist critique, which would gain prominence in the 1970s, went even further. Michel Foucault, for instance, challenged Sartre's notion that the subject could stand as a sovereign source of meaning. In a 1971 lecture, Foucault declared, "The subject is not a pre-existing entity that simply discovers its freedom, it is constituted by power relations." From this perspective, Sartre's humanism remained too centered on an autonomous I, ignoring how power inscribes subjects before they even become aware of themselves. Jacques Derrida, too, questioned the stability of Sartre's being for itself, suggesting that the very idea of a self-presenting freedom is haunted by the difference of language and the trace of the other. These criticisms forced Sartre to refine his arguments. In the later volumes of Critique of Dialectical Reason, he introduced the notion of situated freedom, a term that acknowledges both the agency of the subject and the constraints of the socio-historical context. He wrote, "Freedom is always already mediated by the world, by the practices that constitute us." This formulation anticipates contemporary debates about the balance between structure and agency, echoing Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony. Gramsci argued that the ruling class maintains power not only through economic domination, but also through the shaping of cultural norms and values that make their rule appear natural. Sartre's situated freedom can be read as an attempt to locate the possibility of resistance within the very fabric of that cultural hegemony, suggesting that individuals can subvert dominant narratives from within. Sartre's political engagement did not remain confined to the European theater. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, he threw his intellectual weight behind anti-colonial movements, most notably the Algerian War of Independence. In a 1960 article for Les Temps Modernes, he wrote, "The fight for the liberation of the colonized is inseparable from the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat." He saw the Algerian struggle as a concrete manifestation of the dialectic between the colonizer's material exploitation and the colonized's quest for authentic existence. His support was not merely rhetorical. He helped organize protests in Paris, hosted Algerian intellectuals, and even faced legal repercussions for his outspoken criticism of French colonial policy. One anecdote from that period illustrates the depth of Sartre's commitment. In 1961, during a heated debate at the Sorbonne, a student named Mohammed, whose family had been displaced by the war, stood up and asked Sartre, "Do you truly understand what it means to be denied one's land?" Sartre replied, "I cannot claim to know the exact pain of exile, but I can affirm that the denial of freedom is a universal wound. It is my responsibility, as a philosopher, to stand with you against that wound." The audience erupted in applause, and the incident was later cited by activists as evidence that existentialist philosophy could be a tool for solidarity, not just abstraction. Sartre's involvement with anti-colonial causes also intersected with his critique of the Soviet model. He began to argue that any revolutionary project, whether in Europe or Africa, must avoid reproducing the same hierarchies it seeks to dismantle. In a 1965 interview, he warned, "Revolution without self-critique becomes a new form of oppression." The task of the revolutionary is to keep the possibility of freedom alive, even within the structures it creates. This stance placed him at odds with both the French Communist Party, which still defended Soviet policies, and with more radical Marxist-Leninist groups that prioritized the seizure of state power over democratic deliberation. The synthesis that Sartre pursued can be illustrated with a simple analogy. Imagine a river flowing through a landscape of rocks and valleys. The water represents human freedom, always moving, always seeking a path. The rocks symbolize the material conditions of society, economic relations, class structures, technological constraints. The river cannot flow without the landscape shaping its course, yet the river also erodes the rocks over time, reshaping the terrain. Sartre's critique of dialectical reason attempts to map precisely how the water both follows and transforms the rocks, refusing to see the river as either wholly independent of the terrain or wholly determined by it. Another, more concrete example comes from Sartre's analysis of the French railway workers' strike of 1947. He observed that the workers' decision to stop the trains was not merely an individual act of rebellion, but a collective articulation of their lived experience of exploitation. Their group praxis emerged from the material fact that the railway system depended on their labor, yet the workers also reimagined themselves as agents capable of reshaping the economic order. Sartre wrote, "The strike becomes a moment where the abstract relations of production are made concrete in the lived experience of the workers." This case study demonstrates how Sartre sought to ground existential freedom in the material struggles of the working class, countering the Frankfurt School's claim that he remained too abstract. The legacy of Sartre's political turn can be traced to contemporary leftist debates. In the 21st century, movements such as Occupy Wall Street and the global climate justice protests grapple with the same tension between individual agency and structural determinism. Activists often invoke the language of collective self-determination, echoing Sartre's notion that the individual is always already a part of a group. At the same time, critics within these movements warn against an overemphasis on personal authenticity that could dilute collective demands, a criticism that mirrors the Frankfurt School's concerns about Sartre's humanism. Modern scholars continue to reinterpret Sartre's synthesis. For instance, the political theorist Alain Badiou has argued that Sartre's situated freedom anticipates his own concept of the event as a rupture that reconfigures the conditions of possibility. Badiou writes, Sartre's recognition that freedom is always already mediated anticipates the idea that the event is both a break and a continuity with the existing order. Meanwhile, feminist theorists such as Simone de Beauvoir, who collaborated closely with Sartre, have highlighted how his analysis of freedom often neglected gendered dimensions of oppression. De Beauvoir's The Second Sex critiques Sartre's universalist language, pointing out that the woman's freedom is always already constrained by a patriarchal material reality. Returning to the primary texts, let us recall Sartre's own words from the preface of Critique of Dialectical Reason. "I have tried to think the world as it is, not as I would like it to be, and to understand the freedom of the individual as a concrete historical fact." This statement encapsulates his ambition. To think the world in its full material complexity while preserving the existential claim that each person is responsible for their own choices. It also reflects the humility that underlies his political engagement, a willingness to revise his own positions in light of historical events. The 1964 letter to Merleau-Ponty provides a vivid illustration of this humility. Sartre confessed, "I have been too quick to celebrate the purity of freedom, without seeing how the structures of power can turn even the most sincere intention into a form of domination." He went on to propose a dialectical method of self-criticism, urging Merleau-Ponty to join him in a project that would constantly interrogate the gap between theory and practice. This correspondence became a touchstone for later philosophers who sought to combine critical theory with a lived ethics of freedom. In examining Sartre's break with the PCF, we should not overlook the personal dimension of his political life. A well-known anecdote recounts how, in 1958, Sartre received a call from the party's secretary, asking him to publicly defend the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian uprising. Sartre, after a long silence, replied, "I cannot lend my voice to a lie, even if it serves a cause I once believed in." He hung up the phone, and the conversation was later recounted by his friend Albert Camus in a letter, noting that Sartre's conscience has always been his most demanding interlocutor. This moment of personal integrity illustrates how his philosophical commitment to authenticity translated into political action, even when it meant alienating former allies. The interplay between Sartre's existentialism and Marxism also invites comparison with other attempts at synthesis. Karl Korsch, a German Marxist theorist, earlier tried to integrate Hegelian dialectics with Marxist materialism, emphasizing the role of consciousness. Similarly, the British philosopher G.A. Cohen, in his work History, Labor, and Freedom, argued that Marx's historical materialism already contains a space for individual agency. Sartre's contribution, however, lies in his vivid phenomenological description of lived experience, which provides a more immediate account of how freedom feels from the inside. Moreover, Sartre's political trajectory can be contrasted with that of his contemporary Albert Camus. While Sartre moved toward a Marxist-inspired collective activism, Camus maintained a steadfast commitment to a moral absolutism rooted in the absurd. Their famous split after the publication of Camus's The Rebel in 1951 highlights the divergent ways existentialist philosophers approached politics. Camus accused Sartre of political opportunism, while Sartre retorted that Camus fails to recognize that the rebellion must be rooted in the concrete conditions of oppression. This intellectual duel underscores the broader tension between universalist ethics and historically grounded praxis, a tension that continues to animate leftist debates today. Sartre's engagement with anti-colonial movements also resonates with Frantz Fanon's work. Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, argues that decolonization is a violent rupture that restores the subjectivity denied by colonial domination. Sartre, in his 1961 preface to Fanon's book, praised the work as the most powerful articulation of the oppressed struggle for freedom. He wrote, "Fanon shows us that the colonial world is a concrete example of the dialectic between the oppressor's material dominance and the colonized's existential yearning for authenticity." This endorsement cemented Sartre's position as a philosopher who saw the fight against colonialism as inseparable from the broader struggle for human emancipation. Yet the post-structuralist critique would later argue that Sartre's reliance on a universal human subject still fell short of accounting for the ways in which identity is constructed through discourse. Mitchell Foucault's analysis of power/knowledge suggested that the very categories of human and freedom are products of specific historical regimes. From this perspective, Sartre's attempt to ground freedom in a phenomenological core could be seen as an attempt to rescue a pre-modern notion of the autonomous subject from the deconstructive forces of modern power. In response to such critiques, contemporary scholars have revisited Sartre's later writings, especially his essays on situated freedom and group praxis, to argue that he was already moving toward a more nuanced understanding of subjectivity. They point to his acknowledgement that the self is always constituted by the other, a phrase that anticipates the post-structuralist emphasis on relational identity. By foregrounding the social context in which freedom is exercised, Sartre offers a bridge between the existential affirmation of agency and the structural analysis of Marxism. The practical implications of Sartre's synthesis can be seen in modern social movements that combine identity politics with class analysis. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, insists that racial oppression cannot be separated from economic exploitation. Its slogans, "No justice, no peace," reflect a Sartrean insistence that individuals must take responsibility for confronting injustice while also recognizing the structural forces that sustain it. In a 2020 interview, activist Patrice Cullors cited Sartre's idea that freedom is always already mediated, explaining that our personal experiences of police violence are shaped by a system of capitalism that values certain lives over others. This demonstrates how Sartre's philosophical framework continues to inform contemporary activism. Another illustration comes from the climate justice movement, where activists argue that the ecological crisis is both a material problem, driven by the capitalist mode of production, and a moral one, requiring individuals to act responsibly. The concept of just transition mirrors Sartre's group praxis. Workers in fossil fuel industries are called upon to collectively reimagine their role, not merely as victims of capitalist exploitation, but as agents capable of shaping a sustainable future. This aligns with Sartre's claim that the individual is both a product and a producer of the historical world, emphasizing that personal choices are intertwined with systemic transformation. Sartre's legacy also lives on in academic debates about the role of philosophy in politics. In the 1970s, the French philosopher Louis Althusser, a structuralist Marxist, dismissed Sartre's existentialism as ideological mystification, arguing that the concept of a free subject is a bourgeois illusion that obscures the material base. Althusser wrote, "The humanist discourse of freedom is a superstructure that serves to conceal the real mechanisms of class domination." Yet, later scholars such as Etienne Balibar have defended Sartre, suggesting that his emphasis on praxis provides a necessary corrective to Althusser's deterministic model. Balibar notes that Sartre reintroduces the dimension of agency that is essential for any theory of emancipation. In the realm of literary criticism, Sartre's political philosophy influenced the development of political existentialism in post-colonial literature. Writers like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon drew on Sartre's ideas to articulate the psychological dimensions of oppression. Césaire's poem A Conjuration reflects the existential tension between the desire for freedom and the weight of historical trauma, echoing Sartre's claim that the individual must confront the absurdity of existence while simultaneously striving to reshape the world. Even within Sartre's own literary output, we see the embodiment of his political synthesis. In his novel The Age of Reason, the protagonist Matthew grapples with the responsibility of choosing a course of action in a world shaped by social forces. His internal monologue, "I am free, but my freedom is bound by the walls of the cafe, by the expectations of my friends, by the economic realities that dictate my rent," captures the dialectical tension that Sartre later formalized in Critique of Dialectical Reason. The novel thus serves as a narrative laboratory where existential freedom is tested against material constraints. To further illustrate Sartre's attempt to reconcile existentialism with Marxist materialism, consider the case of the French student protests of May 1968. The movement began as a spontaneous outburst of discontent among university students, who demanded greater personal autonomy, an end to authoritarian teaching methods, and a radical restructuring of society. As the protests spread to factories, the slogan "All Power to the Imagination" emerged, blending the existential call for authentic self-creation with Marxist calls for workers' control. Sartre, who was then a public intellectual, gave a televised interview in which he declared, "The revolt of the youth is the revolt of freedom against a world that denies it." He recognized that the students' desire for personal liberation could not be separated from their critique of the capitalist system that limited their possibilities. The aftermath of May '68 also revealed the limits of Sartre's synthesis. While the movement succeeded in shaking the foundations of French society, it ultimately failed to produce a lasting structural transformation. Critics argued that the emphasis on spontaneity and personal expression, hallmarks of existentialist influence, prevented the formation of a cohesive class-based program. The Frankfurt School's earlier critique resurfaced. Without a solid class analysis, the movement risked dissipating into a series of individualistic demands. Yet, supporters of Sartre's approach pointed out that the very experience of collective improvisation, workers and students negotiating in real time, embodied the group praxis he had envisioned. In the decades that followed, Sartre continued to refine his political thought, engaging with the emerging field of psychoanalysis. In a series of essays on being and nothingness in psychoanalysis, he explored how unconscious drives intersect with conscious freedom, suggesting that the human subject is simultaneously a free agent and a product of psychic structures shaped by society. This interdisciplinary turn anticipated later developments in critical theory, where scholars such as Slavoj Žižek would combine Lacanian psychoanalysis with Marxist critique, building on Sartre's early attempts to bridge phenomenology and materialism. Sartre's final years were marked by a deepening commitment to anti-imperialist solidarity. In 1971, he signed the Manifesto of the 121, a declaration supporting the right of French conscripts to refuse service in the Algerian War. He wrote, "The refusal to kill is an affirmation of freedom, even when the state demands obedience." This act of civil disobedience, rooted in his existential belief that existence precedes essence, also reflected his Marxist analysis of the state as an instrument of class oppression. By refusing to serve, the individual directly challenges the material apparatus of the state, thereby enacting a concrete form of praxis. The philosophical legacy of Sartre's political engagement is perhaps most vividly captured in the words of the contemporary activist philosopher Judith Butler, who, in a 2015 essay, remarked, "Sartre's situated freedom reminds us that the fight for gender equality must be understood as both a personal act of self-definition and a collective struggle against the material conditions that produce gendered oppression." Butler's invocation of Sartre demonstrates how his synthesis continues to inform intersectional analyses that seek to unite personal identity politics with structural critiques. To bring these threads together, let us return to the central question: can existential freedom and Marxist materialism truly be reconciled? Sartre's answer was a tentative yet hopeful yes. He argued that freedom is not a metaphysical abstraction, but a lived condition that emerges within and can transform the material world. His concept of group praxis offers a framework where individual agency and collective structures co-constitute each other. The criticisms from the Frankfurt School and post-structuralists sharpen this claim, reminding us that any synthesis must remain vigilant against both reductionism and abstraction. In contemporary political philosophy, this tension is still alive. The rise of post-growth or degrowth movements, for instance, wrestle with the need to imagine new forms of freedom that are not predicated on endless economic expansion. They echo Sartre's insistence that the individual is both a product and a producer of the historical world, proposing that we must reconfigure the material basis of society to enable authentic freedom. Likewise, the resurgence of interest in democratic socialism, especially after the 2020 U.S. elections, revives the debate over how to integrate personal autonomy with collective ownership of the means of production. precisely the terrain Sartre attempted to map. Finally, let us listen once more to Sartre's own voice, from the preface of Critique of Dialectical Reason. I have tried to think the world as it is, not as I would like it to be, and to understand the freedom of the individual as a concrete historical fact. In those words, we hear a philosopher who never abandoned the demand that thought must be engaged with reality, who never ceased to ask whether the freedom he championed could survive the pressures of history. His journey from the enthusiastic member of the French Communist Party, through the painful break after Hungary, to the steadfast supporter of anti-colonial liberation, embodies a relentless search for a politics that honors both the singularity of the human subject and the collective forces that shape our lives. As we reflect on Sartre's attempt to synthesize existentialism and Marxism, we are invited to consider our own position within the dialectic of freedom and structure. Are we, like Sartre, willing to confront the contradictions of our time, to critique the institutions that limit us, while also embracing the responsibility of personal choice? The answer perhaps lies not in a final doctrinal synthesis, but in the ongoing practice of group praxis, the continual, situated effort to turn our individual freedoms into collective transformation. In that spirit, Sartre's political philosophy remains a living invitation to act, to think, and to imagine a world where freedom is both a personal commitment and a shared project. When we turn our gaze toward the afterglow of Jean-Paul Sartre's thought, we find a landscape that stretches far beyond the cramped cafes of post-war Paris, reaching into the corridors of literature, the consulting rooms of psychotherapy, the neon-lit streets of cinema, and even the pixelated realms of video game narratives. It is tempting to think of Sartre as a figure confined to the mid-20th century existentialist boom, but his legacy, like a river that refuses to be dammed, has carved new channels in places he could scarcely have imagined. In this segment, we will wander through those channels, pause at the bridges of critique, and linger at the crossroads where contemporary thinkers either pick up his torch or lay it down. As we do so, ask yourself, what does it mean to claim radical freedom in an age where algorithms already anticipate our desires? First, let us consider the way Sartre's ideas have seeped into the very fabric of modern literature. The novelist who writes with a consciousness of being for itself and being in itself does not merely echo a philosophical jargon. He or she is enacting a mode of storytelling that insists on the reader's active participation. Take, for example, the French author Albert Camus, whose own absurdist works were in constant dialogue with Sartre's notion that existence precedes essence. In The Stranger, Meursault's indifferent gaze upon the world can be read as a dramatization of Sartre's claim that we are condemned to be free, forced to choose even when we feel we have none. Yet Camus later distanced himself, arguing that Sartre's emphasis on freedom neglected the weight of the absurd. This literary tension illustrates how Sartre's concepts have become a kind of dialectical engine, driving writers to explore the paradox of choice and meaning. Across the Atlantic, the influence of Sartre can be traced to the American literary scene through the beat poets, whose improvisational verses echo the existential insistence on authenticity. Allen Ginsberg's Howl bursts with a raw declaration of self-creation, a poetic embodiment of Sartre's existence precedes essence. Even later, the postmodern novelist Don DeLillo weaves Sartre's ideas into the fabric of his narratives about media saturation and the loss of authentic selfhood. In White Noise, the characters grapple with a world that seems to dissolve any stable sense of being, a condition that Sartre would have described as bad faith, when they hide behind the comfort of consumer culture rather than confront the abyss of freedom. The reach of Sartre's thought does not stop at the page. In the realm of psychology, his existential phenomenology has been a cornerstone for what we now call existential therapy. Pioneers such as Rollo May and Irvin Yalom drew directly from Sartre's insistence that humans are thrown into a world without predetermined purpose, and that the therapeutic task is to help patients confront the anxiety that arises from this freedom. Yalom in Existential Psychotherapy writes, "The human condition is a drama of freedom, responsibility, meaning, isolation, and death." He cites Sartre's Being and Nothingness as a source for understanding how individuals can slip into bad faith by denying their freedom, thereby creating neurotic patterns. In practice, an existential therapist may ask a client to identify moments when they have chosen, rather than simply reacted, to illuminate the hidden agency that Sartre so passionately defended. The therapeutic setting thus becomes a microcosm of Sartre's philosophical laboratory, where the client's project of self-creation is examined with both compassion and rigor. One might wonder how the abstract musings of an existential philosopher translate into the concrete world of popular culture. The answer lies in the way Sartre's ideas have been reimagined in film, most famously in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. The replicants, engineered beings who seek to extend their predetermined lifespans, embody Sartre's notion of being for itself, confronting the limits imposed by being in itself. When Roy Batty declares, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe," he is not merely lamenting his mortality. He is asserting a claim to authenticity, a demand that his existence be recognized as more than a programmed function. The film's recurring motif of more human than human resonates with Sartre's claim that humanity is defined not by essence but by the choices we make, even when those choices are forced upon us by technological determinism. Video game narratives have become a fertile ground for Sartrean themes, perhaps more than any other medium. Consider the 2015 game The Last of Us Part II, where the player is confronted with a series of morally ambiguous decisions that shape the protagonist's identity. The game's design forces the player to confront the weight of freedom. Each action carries consequences that ripple through the story, echoing Sartre's assertion that man is condemned to be free. Because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. Similarly, the open-world RPG The Witcher 3 presents Geralt of Rivia with choices that have no clear moral hierarchy, inviting the player to inhabit the Sartrean space of anguish of freedom. In both cases, the medium itself becomes a laboratory for existential experimentation, allowing players to experience the anxiety and exhilaration of creating meaning in a world that offers no pre-written script. Yet, as Sartre's ideas spread, they have also attracted sharp critiques. One of the most persistent accusations is that Sartre, in his own philosophical practice, embodied a kind of intellectual hubris that mirrors the very philosopher king he warned against. Critics point to his self-appointment as the spokesperson for the human condition, his prolific output, and his involvement in political activism as evidence of an overbearing confidence in the universality of his claims. Simone de Beauvoir, his lifelong companion and intellectual partner, once remarked that Sartre writes as if he were the only one who can see the world, a comment that underscores the perception of his philosophical arrogance. The accusation intensifies when we examine Sartre's own admission in the preface to Being and Nothingness that he wrote to convince himself, suggesting a self-justifying impulse that blurs the line between philosophical inquiry and personal vindication. This critique invites us to ask, can a thinker who insists on radical freedom truly avoid imposing his own vision upon others, or does the very act of articulating a comprehensive system of freedom become a form of domination? A second, more contemporary critique emerges from postmodern theorists who argue that Sartre's conception of absolute freedom is untenable in a fragmented, hyper-mediated world. Thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard and Jacques Derrida have contended that the very idea of a unified, self-determining subject is a fiction, replaced by a decentered network of discourses and power relations. In The Postmodern Condition, Lyotard writes that the grand narratives of modernity have lost their legitimacy, implying that Sartre's grand narrative of freedom no longer holds sway. Derrida, in his deconstruction of Sartre's notion of presence, suggests that the self is always already mediated by language, thus never fully present to make an unconditioned choice. From this perspective, the Sartrean claim that we are condemned to be free appears to overlook the ways in which our choices are pre-shaped by cultural, linguistic, and technological structures that we cannot simply outrun. In an age of algorithmic recommendation engines, biometric data, and social media echo chambers, the question becomes even more pressing. Is freedom an illusion, or can it be reclaimed through awareness and resistance? Contemporary philosophers have taken up these challenges, either to revive Sartre's insights or to dismantle them. Alain Badiou, for instance, acknowledges Sartre's contribution to the ontology of the subject, but insists on a different foundation for freedom. In Being an Event, Badiou proposes that true freedom is not the endless project of self-creation, but the fidelity to an event that ruptures the existing order and opens a space for new truths. He writes, the subject is not the product of its own freedom, but the subject of a truth that it recognizes. In this sense, Badiou reframes Sartrean freedom as a derivative of a larger transcendent rupture rather than an endless personal project. He thus preserves the radical potential of freedom while avoiding the solipsistic pitfalls that critics accuse Sartre of falling into. Judith Butler offers another line of engagement, particularly through the lens of gender performativity. Butler draws on Sartre's notion that we are condemned to be free, to argue that identity is continuously constituted through performative acts. Engender trouble, she states, if we are always already constituted as subjects, then the freedom we possess is the freedom to re-articulate the norms that shape us. While Sartre emphasized the individual's capacity to transcend facticity, Butler highlights how social norms pre-structure the field of possible actions. She thus reframes Sartrean freedom as a strategic, collective endeavor, where the individual's agency is exercised within, and sometimes against, the matrix of power. In doing so, Butler both honors and expands Sartre's insight, showing that freedom can be a site of resistance against normative structures rather than an isolated, abstract ideal. The dialogue between Sartre and contemporary thought extends beyond academic circles into everyday cultural practices. In the realm of fashion, designers like Alexander McQueen have invoked existential motifs, creating collections that dramatize the tension between authenticity and commodification. McQueen's 1999 Highland Rape collection, for instance, can be read as a sartorial embodiment of Sartre's bad faith, where the models appear trapped in a narrative imposed upon them, yet the very act of walking the runway becomes an assertion of agency against that narrative. In the music industry, the lyricism of artists such as Radiohead often mirrors Sartrean anxiety. The line, "We are the dead from no surprises," resonates with the existential dread of confronting a world that seems indifferent, while the song "Everything in its Right Place" evokes the unsettling feeling of being forced into a predetermined order, prompting listeners to question the authenticity of their own choices. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how Sartre's ideas have been lived out, sometimes with tragic consequences. During the Algerian War, Sartre took a public stand against colonial oppression, arguing that the colonized were denied the freedom to define themselves. He famously wrote, "The colonized are not a problem to be solved, they are a people to be liberated." Yet, his involvement also sparked controversy among his peers, some of whom accused him of imposing his existential framework onto a complex political situation. This episode demonstrates the double-edged nature of Sartre's activism. While his commitment to freedom inspired solidarity, it also revealed the risk of reducing diverse struggles to a single philosophical narrative. A more recent anecdote involves the French filmmaker Claire Denis, whose 1994 film I'm Going Home reflects Sartre's influence on cinematic storytelling. Denis once recounted in an interview that she was inspired by Sartre's idea that the world is a stage for our projects, prompting her to craft a narrative where the protagonist, a composer, navigates the disorienting terrain of identity and belonging in a foreign land. The film's ambiguous ending, leaving the audience to wonder whether the character truly finds an authentic self, mirrors Sartre's claim that freedom is never final, but an ongoing project. Denis's work exemplifies how Sartre's existential vocabulary has become a toolkit for artists seeking to dramatize the fluidity of identity. When we look at the digital age, the resonance of Sartre's radical freedom becomes both more urgent and more complicated. Social media platforms present a paradoxical arena where users are simultaneously empowered to curate their identities and constrained by algorithmic feeds that predict and shape those very choices. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han, in The Burnout Society, argues that the neoliberal promise of unlimited self-optimization mirrors Sartre's condemnation to freedom, but without the accompanying authenticity. He writes, "We have become the entrepreneurs of our own existence, yet we are never truly free because the market decides what counts as valuable." In this sense, Sartre's warning about bad faith acquires a new dimension. We may be complicit in our own subjugation when we mistake market-driven self-branding for genuine self-creation. Yet, there are also hopeful reinterpretations. The rise of digital existentialism, a term coined by contemporary scholars, suggests that the internet can serve as a space for authentic self-exploration. Online communities devoted to philosophy, such as the subreddit r/existentialism, provide platforms where individuals can discuss and confront the anxiety of freedom in a supportive environment. In these digital salons, Sartre's call to act as if your life were a work of art finds a new audience willing to experiment with identity, purpose, and responsibility. The very fact that we can collectively deliberate on the meaning of freedom, across continents and time zones, hints at a democratization of Sartre's project, a move away from the philosopher-king model toward a distributed, participatory form of existential inquiry. The influence of Sartre also extends into the field of artificial intelligence. Researchers working on autonomous agents often grapple with the question of whether machines can possess a form of freedom akin to Sartrean agency. In a 2022 paper, philosopher David J. Gunkel argues that the notion of a machine as a being for itself challenges traditional Sartrean ontology. but also invites a rethinking of freedom as a relational property rather than an isolated capacity. While Sartre himself could not have imagined neural networks, his insistence that freedom is inseparable from responsibility invites us to consider the ethical implications of granting agency to artificial entities. If we accept that freedom entails accountability, then the design of AI systems must incorporate mechanisms for moral reflection, a modern echo of Sartre's demand that each individual own the weight of their choices. In the realm of education, existential pedagogy draws directly from Sartre's emphasis on personal responsibility. Teachers who adopt an existential approach encourage students to confront the nothingness that underlies knowledge, prompting them to actively construct meaning rather than passively absorb information. This method reflects Sartre's claim that man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, urging learners to see themselves as co-authors of their intellectual journey. Such pedagogical practices have been adopted in progressive schools worldwide, from the Montessori movement to contemporary unschooling communities, illustrating how Sartre's philosophical legacy informs how we think about learning, growth, and agency. Returning to the critiques, it is worth revisiting the accusation of intellectual hubris with a more nuanced lens. While Sartre's prolific output and public persona may suggest a desire to dominate the philosophical conversation, his willingness to engage with criticism, most notably his public debate with Michel Foucault in 1970, reveals a commitment to dialogue rather than dogma. In that debate, Sartre challenged Foucault's genealogical method, insisting that the individual must not be reduced to a product of power structures. Foucault, in turn, retorted that the subject is always a site of power. This exchange epitomizes the productive tension between Sartre's focus on individual freedom and Foucault's emphasis on systemic forces. Rather than confirming hubris, the debate underscores Sartre's role as a catalyst for ongoing philosophical conversation, a role that continues to inspire both supporters and detractors. The postmodern critique that Sartre's absolute freedom is untenable also invites us to reconsider what freedom actually entails. Contemporary philosophers like Slavoj Žižek reinterpret Sartre through a Lacanian lens, suggesting that freedom is not the simple act of choosing, but the recognition of the lack that drives desire. Žižek writes, Sartre's freedom is not a celebration of autonomy, but a confrontation with the void that compels us to act. In this reading, freedom becomes a paradoxical mix of constraint and possibility, echoing the postmodern suspicion that any claim to unbounded agency must be tempered by the structures that shape desire. By integrating psychoanalytic insights, Žižek offers a bridge between Sartre's existentialism and the fragmented realities of contemporary life. Judith Butler's approach, as mentioned earlier, also reframes Sartre's freedom within a performative matrix. She argues that the very act of choosing is always already mediated by discursive norms, suggesting that Sartre's radical freedom must be understood as a strategic navigation of power rather than a pure, unconditioned liberty. This perspective resonates with the experiences of activists in the Black Lives Matter movement, who articulate a collective freedom that emerges not from isolated individual choices, but from coordinated action that reshapes public discourse. The movement's slogan, "I am not the system, I am the system," captures the Sartrean insight that we are both products of facticity and agents capable of transcending it, while simultaneously acknowledging that our agency is amplified through communal solidarity. In the field of ethics, Sartre's insistence on responsibility has been taken up by contemporary moral philosophers seeking to address climate change. The concept of existential responsibility has been employed to argue that each individual must recognize their role in the planetary crisis, not as a passive victim of systemic forces, but as an active participant whose choices contribute to collective outcomes. Philosopher Timothy Morton, in his work on dark ecology, references Sartre when he writes, "We are condemned to be free in a world that is already dying, and our freedom must be exercised with an awareness of ecological interdependence." This synthesis of existential freedom and environmental ethics demonstrates how Sartre's ideas can be reoriented toward pressing global challenges. Even the world of gaming, which we touched upon earlier, continues to evolve Sartrean themes in innovative ways. The indie game What Remains of Edith Finch invites players to experience a series of vignettes that explore the limits of agency and narrative closure. Each story within the game presents a character confronting the inevitability of death, echoing Sartre's meditation on nothingness and the way in which the awareness of finitude can spur authentic choices. The game's design deliberately leaves many decisions ambiguous, compelling the player to reflect on whether any action can truly be free in a world scripted by the developers. This meta-commentary on freedom mirrors Sartre's own awareness of the constraints imposed by language and philosophy. As we examine these varied manifestations, literature, psychotherapy, cinema, video games, fashion, AI, education, activism, we see a common thread. Sartre's insistence that we are perpetually called to define ourselves, even when the stage upon which we act is constantly shifting. The question remains, however, whether this call is a liberating invitation or an oppressive demand. The answer may lie in the way we choose to interpret Sartre's legacy. If we view his philosophy as a rigid blueprint for personal sovereignty, we risk reproducing the very philosopher-king dynamic that critics decry. If instead we treat his insights as a set of tools for interrogating the conditions of our existence, we can harness his emphasis on responsibility to navigate the complexities of our digital age. Consider the modern phenomenon of digital detox. Individuals who voluntarily disconnect from smartphones and social media often describe the experience as a reclamation of authentic selfhood, a moment where they can confront their own freedom without the constant bombardment of curated content. This practice can be seen as a contemporary enactment of Sartre's call to act in spite of the absurd. Yet even the decision to detox is mediated by cultural narratives that valorize mindfulness and self-care, suggesting that the very act of choosing a free lifestyle is embedded within a network of meaning. Here, Sartre's warning about bad faith becomes a useful lens. Are we truly choosing to unplug, or are we simply following the latest trend that promises authenticity? Another illustration comes from the rise of creator economies, where individuals monetize personal content on platforms like YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok. On the one hand, these creators embody Sartrean freedom. They craft their own narratives, define their own brands, and assume responsibility for their digital personas. On the other hand, they operate within algorithmic constraints that prioritize certain formats and engagement metrics, echoing the postmodern critique that freedom is always already shaped by external structures. The tension between self-authorship and platform governance mirrors Sartre's dialectic between facticity and transcendence. Some creators, aware of this paradox, explicitly address it in their content, framing their work as a critique of the very systems that enable them, a modern, performative version of Sartre's existential rebellion. In the academic sphere, the dialogue between Sartre and contemporary philosophers continues to evolve. Alain Badiou's concept of the event can be read as an attempt to preserve the radical openness of Sartre's freedom while grounding it in a communal ontology. Judith Butler's performative theory reframes freedom as a collective negotiation, emphasizing that the subject's agency is always already entangled with social norms. Slavoj Žižek's psychoanalytic reinterpretation injects a layer of desire and lack, suggesting that freedom is never a clean break from the symbolic order. Each of these thinkers, in their own way, acknowledges the power of Sartre's insight while also pointing out its limitations, thereby ensuring that his legacy remains a living conversation rather than a static monument. The legacy of Sartre also endures in the realm of political activism. The anti-globalization protests of the early 2000s, for example, were infused with existential rhetoric that emphasized personal responsibility for systemic change. Protesters often invoked the slogan, "We are the change we seek," a direct echo of Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence. Yet, the very organization of these movements required collective structures, highlighting the paradox that individual freedom must be exercised within communal frameworks. This dynamic illustrates how Sartre's ideas can inspire both personal empowerment and collective action, a duality that remains relevant in contemporary social movements such as climate justice and digital rights advocacy. When we reflect on Sartre's impact on popular culture, it is impossible to ignore the way his ideas have been distilled into catchphrases and memes. The phrase, "no exit," originally the title of his 1944 play, has become shorthand for situations where individuals feel trapped by social expectations. The meme, "we are all just a bunch of couches waiting for someone to sit on us," an internet adaptation of Sartre's notion that hell is other people, demonstrates how his philosophical insights have been repurposed for humor while still conveying a deeper truth about interpersonal dynamics. These cultural artifacts, though seemingly trivial, indicate that Sartre's concepts have permeated the collective unconscious, shaping how we talk about freedom, responsibility, and the social self. Yet the proliferation of such simplifications also raises the concern that Sartre's nuanced arguments are being flattened into slogans, potentially reinforcing the critique of intellectual hubris. If we reduce existence precedes essence to a motivational poster, do we lose the critical edge that Sartre intended? The danger lies in transforming a profound existential challenge into a feel-good mantra, thereby sidestepping the uncomfortable labor of confronting the anguish of freedom that Sartre so vividly described. In this sense, the contemporary reception of Sartre's ideas forces us to grapple with the balance between accessibility and depth. To bring these threads together, let us revisit a passage from Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism, where he declares, "Man is condemned to be free. Because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." This sentence, simple yet powerful, continues to reverberate across disciplines. It reminds us that freedom is not a gift but a burden, that our actions are always already implicated in a larger tapestry of meaning. Whether we encounter this idea in a therapist's office, a film noir, a video game narrative, or an activist rally, the core challenge remains to recognize that our choices matter, even when the world seems to dictate them. As we stand at the intersection of Sartre's existential legacy and the digital age's unprecedented connectivity, we must ask ourselves how we will navigate the paradox of freedom in a world that both amplifies and constrains our agency. Will we embrace the radical responsibility that Sartre demands, using the tools of technology to craft authentic selves, or will we retreat into the comforting illusion that algorithms already know what is best for us, thereby surrendering our freedom to unseen forces? The answer perhaps lies not in a single verdict, but in the ongoing, lived practice of questioning, of choosing, and of taking ownership of the consequences that follow. So as we close this exploration of Sartre's lasting impact, I invite you to pause and consider. In a moment when every swipe, every click, every share seems to shape who we are, how do we honor the existential call to be the authors of our own lives? Do we see ourselves as the protagonists of a narrative we write, or as characters whose scripts are already written by the platforms we inhabit? The tension between these possibilities is where Sartre's philosophy continues to pulse, urging us to confront the freedom that is both a gift and a responsibility. The choice, as always, remains ours.